He's like a bad smell, isn't he? Or a kind of unflushable deposit in the bottom of your toilet bowl. But Boris Johnson somehow managed to insert himself yesterday into, if not the actual news agenda, then certainly the online chatter, the social media chatter. Can you guess what he did? Boris Johnson. You remember Boris Johnson, the one that lied about everything, yeah? And then legged it before he could be held to account by his own parliamentary peers. So he turned up to vote, having been Prime Minister when the legislation was introduced demanding that you come with photo ID when voting, something that if you did vote yesterday, you will have observed. And guess what? He didn't have any photo ID with him, so he was prevented from casting a vote. So, I mean, there's so many times you think that you've happened upon the most perfect distillation of Boris Johnson's moral corruption or epic incompetence. And then up he pops, like I say, like a bad smell or an unflushable deposit, and gives you yet another shining example of just how absolutely awful he is. The Prime Minister who introduced voter ID legislation for no reason except in the hope of gerrymandering the vote and excluding younger people from the franchise. The Prime Minister who introduced voter ID forgot to turn up with voter ID at a polling station yesterday. And this being Boris Johnson, there are three possibilities here. Number one is that he's just stupid and he forgot. Number two is that he honestly feels, as he felt at school, because his headmaster, of course, wrote about it, he honestly feels that he should not be expected or required to abide by the same rules that the rest of us, the same network of obligations. Was that the phrase that his housemaster used? The network of obligations that bind the rest of us. Because that's the thing about networks of obligations. It's not just about following them for following them's sake. These are the invisible frameworks that bind together societies. We all agree not to behave in certain ways. We all agree to have sort of respect for certain traditions. And Boris Johnson has never subscribed to that worldview. He clearly and deeply believes he should be exempt from the network of obligations that binds the rest of us, possibly up to and including the necessity of turning up with voter ID as a consequence of a law that he actually passed. Of course, he has a rich record of treating laws he passed with complete contempt, as we know. So option one, epic incompetence. Option two, epic entitlement. What would option three be? Epic narcissism. Could it possibly be that he thought, well, I haven't been in the news for a while, folks, and all the attention today is going to be focused on other panjandrums and various figures. I am going to turn up at the polling station. That was quite good for a while, that impression. It's tailed off now. They always do, my impressions. But I think I sort of got about 12% there, did I? In the opening salvos there. I'm going to... here's a jolly jape. Here's a wizard wheeze. I'm going to turn up without my photos and see what happens. I'm Boris Johnson. Surely you recognise me. Boris. Vote. So that anyway, I mentioned that in... sort of as a side order to the question that we're going to begin with today. Mike in Sheffield's gone for option three. He did it on purpose, James, to get into the headlines. And this one's nice from Barbara. James O'Brien is one of the rudest people on the planet. Should he really be allowed to refer to anyone in the way he just has to Boris Johnson? Barbara, this is a trigger warning. I've barely started, so I'm just going to give you a moment to retune your radio. Classic FM's very nice at this time of day. Alexander Armstrong doing a lovely job. We sometimes bump into each other around the toilets here at Global Radio. So, Barbara, just pop on Alexander, and then I'll get stuck into the single most disgusting man ever to hold high office in this country. Not just in my lifetime, but also in yours. Okay? Have a great day. We'll see you. I may see you on Monday, I may not. Tuesday. 7 minutes after 10 is the time. So, I mentioned Boris Johnson. And quite a few of you are going for option 3, 2 and 1 all at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive. They are mutually exclusive. It can't be option 1 and option 3. He can't be epically incompetent and deliberately doing it in order to garner attention. Andy, my impression of Boris Johnson did not sound like a Geordie. I grant you that a lot of my other impressions do, particularly my attempt at a Scottish accent. But that one is... I'm with Tom on this one. He said, fantastic impression, James. And Sarah has paid me the highest compliment possible on LBC Radio. She says that impression was better than Nick Abbott's. Thank you, Sarah. I shall hold that close to my heart for the rest of today. So I've talked about Boris Johnson there for 4 or 5 minutes because the question I'm going to ask you involves him. It involves a general election result in 2019 which saw the Conservatives romp, to use a word I'm sure he rather likes, well, in fact, a hobby he rather likes over the years, but the Conservatives romped. One of those words you only ever see in newspapers. No one ever uses that word in real life, do they? What did we do? Should we have a bit of a romp this weekend, darling? Boris Johnson and his Conservative Party, although it was very much a Boris Johnson-defined Conservative Party, not least because they'd slung out almost everybody honest, or at least everybody prepared to be publicly honest, or sacrificed them upon the altar of Dominic Cummings's fever dreams. God, there's a name we haven't said on the radio for a while. So Boris Johnson romped to an enormous victory in 2019, and there was a sense abroad that the Tories were bedding in for generations. The Labour Party was in complete disarray. The Labour Party at the time was a circular firing squad. The Parliamentary Labour Party had been led for the best part of half a decade by a man who most of the Parliamentary Labour Party, for good or for ill, today's not the day to relitigate that conversation, but most of the Parliamentary Labour Party considered him to be a liability, even as they were compelled by either principle or ambition, or a combination of both, to campaign for him to become installed in Downing Street. So the Labour Party was in complete disarray. The idea when Keir Starmer became leader that he would be able to transform the party at all, never mind this quickly, into an eminently electable operation was fanciful. It was pie in the sky. I interviewed him. When did we do the interview at the Leicester Square Theatre with him? That was when I just found my first time I had personal contact with him, and I just found myself thinking that maybe he can do something here. Maybe he can turn this oil tanker around. But what, of course, you didn't take into account when you were contemplating Keir Starmer's prospects, Keir Starmer's electoral prospects, was the other side of the coin, of course, which is a Tory collapse. So how much of the Labour Party's current good fortune is down to the Labour Party's current good politics, and how much is down to the Tory Party's sort of hemorrhaging of support and credibility in equal measure, I do not know. I don't know who does know. Maybe you do, in which case it's time to remind you that the number to call is 03456060973. Because the question I'd like to ask you is, how much of this is Rishi Sunak's fault? I had a bit of a revelation this morning. Actually, Eleanor did, the producer, but I'm stealing it and passing it off as my own. Because, I've written in my new book, in the paperback of my new book, which has a chapter on Rishi Sunak, about how any hopes you had that he might be signalling a reversal of moral corruption or epic incompetence, the sort of Boris Johnson-Liz Truss cocktail, disappeared the minute that he put Suella Braverman back in the Home Office. But that's the woolly liberal hoping against hope that Sunak would somehow turn out to be made of better stuff than the Prime Minister under whom he'd served as Chancellor, or the woman who had beaten him to the leadership. That was the woolly liberal, the naive centrist, the centrist dad, whatever phrases you like, what other phrases you prefer. The people like me, really, looking at Rishi Sunak from quite a myopic angle, a myopic perspective, looking at the single issue, really, of sort of personal credibility or personal ethics almost, and thinking he must be as disgusted by what's gone on under Boris Johnson morally and what's gone on under Liz Truss fiscally. He must be as disgusted as, for example, I am, or you are, or we all are, and therefore he will want to undertake a significant sea change. He will want to put clear blue water between himself and the two who went before, even though with the first one he served as Chancellor of the Exchequer, the second most powerful person in government. And that's what we were signing up for as people who were never, I speak for myself here, someone who is probably highly unlikely, impossible in fact to imagine any circumstances whatsoever in which I would vote Conservative in a general election. Unless I had an individual MP who was somehow completely detached from like a sort of Conservative equivalent of Jeremy Corbyn back in the day when he was a backbencher, if you like, and they'd managed to secure such a huge personal following and such a huge personal success rate that you could completely abandon party loyalties, and you'd be working on the presumption that the party you wanted to govern were going to win anyway. You could completely abandon party loyalties and cast a vote according entirely to the attributes of the individual candidate. But He didn't, did he? He appointed Suella Braverman back to the Home Office, and we immediately found ourselves going, oh, crikey, he's just as bad as the rest of them. But that won't have resonated beyond the centrist dad, the woolly liberal circle. There's no one in the red wall who liked Boris Johnson's lies and liked Priti Patel's rhetoric about small boats or Suella Braverman's rhetoric about brutalising refugees. Nobody there, none of those votes will have been lost when he put Suella Braverman back in the Home Office. So that analysis, albeit that it's now published in black and white and available in all good bookshops, I think it's even on Waterstone's buy one, get one half price offer this week. So that analysis, although completely accurate, is skewed towards people like me. It's skewed towards the woolly liberal, the centrist dad. Oh, Rishi Sunak, things went wrong for him the minute that he put Suella Braverman back in the Home Office. But that's not true. Because if he hadn't put Suella Braverman back in the Home Office, I still wouldn't be voting for him if we ever get around to having a general election. And that simple observation, which my producer arrived at this morning, that simple observation opens the door to the possibility that none of this is Rishi Sunak's fault, or that not all of this is Rishi Sunak's fault, or that only a little bit of this is Rishi Sunak's fault. An epic collapse in the space of 5 years. So that's 3 prime ministers, 5 years, and from a historic win, worst in 80 years for Labour, to a historic loss overnight, looks like being the worst in 80 years for the Conservatives. Different measures, different natures of elections, but still striking in terms of that span of decades. How much of this is on Rishi Sunak? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. It is being reported this morning that Rishi Sunak is now polling on a personal level even worse than Liz Truss did, but that doesn't mean that everything... what could he have done differently? Do you see what I mean? He inherited a Skipfire pretending to be a Ferrari. That's probably the best way of describing Boris Johnson's. Actually, that's probably the best way of describing Boris Johnson, never mind his premiership. He inherited a Skipfire pretending to be a Ferrari from Boris Johnson, and yet, of course, he has to get into the Skipfire. And he inherited, what's worse than a Skipfire pretending to be a Ferrari? I don't know, really. He inherited a clown car with no steering wheel heading straight towards... It was already gone off a cliff. He inherited a car that had already gone off a cliff from Liz Truss. So he inherited 2 vehicles. He inherited a clown car pretending to be a Ferrari and a charabanc driven by Liz Truss that had already gone off a cliff, and his job was somehow to ensure a softer landing than would otherwise have occurred if Liz Truss had stayed in Downing Street. So, clever clogs morning today. I want proper thinking, proper politics. I've resisted the urge to have a coma morning. My coma mornings usually kick in when there's been an election, and I say, can you explain to someone who's been in a coma for the last 5 years how the hell the Tories have managed to go from world-beating election results to absolute carnage? Actually, that's quite a good question as well. I reserve the right to ask you that later. Can we begin with the Prime Minister, though? As I think we probably must. How much of this is Rishi Sunak's fault? In fact, I'll go further, because that way I can become the coconut and you can throw your balls at me. I don't think this is Rishi Sunak's fault anywhere near as much as Boris Johnson and Liz Truss's catastrophes were their fault. It doesn't mean I like him. It doesn't mean I defend him. It doesn't mean that I excuse or exonerate him. I just think he is more a victim of circumstance than a victim of his own failings. Discuss. And you can, of course, discuss by dialing 0345 6060 973. And I guess the underpinning question of how much of this mess is on Rishi Sunak personally would be, what could he have done differently? That's a really good question. Well, at least in the sense that when I ask you something that I can't begin to answer myself, I always think it's a really good question. There is only one way to find out. The phone lines are open. It's 18 minutes after 10, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. 21 minutes after 10 is the time. It is a historically poor performance, although results still to come in. Some mayoralties look... I don't know if I should tell you this because I love him like a brother, but a beloved former colleague, formerly of this parish, he has tweeted overnight, and his sources are pretty strong, that the London mayoral result may actually be a shock, which would be a shock. I've run it by a couple of other colleagues, And it's fair to say that we would all be very, very surprised if Susan Hall were to be returned as the Conservative Mayor of London. But I suggested to you a while ago, I couldn't say anything during the Purdah period, that it was an odd election where Sadiq Khan was campaigning largely on not being Susan Hall, which reduced it to a very sort of unsatisfactory affair. But I digress. We're talking about the big picture, and the big picture is catastrophe for the Conservatives. And the big question is how much of the responsibility lies with Rishi Sunak personally. Khalid is in Edmonton. Khalid, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Good morning.
Sorry, did I hear that right? You're showing sympathy for our Prime Minister.
Sympathy is too strong a word, but I am, in an entirely objective capacity, I'm wondering, A, what he could have done differently, and B, how much of the current catastrophe is essentially inheritance as opposed to consequence of his own actions.
Okay, so I'm going to go with, it is completely his own fault. I mean, to use your analogy, the car's off the cliff, but he could have pulled the parachute.
How? What did the parachute look like?
He could have drawn a red line to Boris Johnson and obviously Liz Truss's era and just say, look, enough of lying. And he did actually mention it on the steps of Downing Street, didn't he? A return to integrity was what he said. I think, and if you remember the euphoria, well, there was mild euphoria, wasn't there, when he got elected, the first Prime Minister of colour. There was a sense of, this is very progressive, we finally got moving on. And then the next day he appointed Suella Braverman and carried on with, exactly what you thought the Tories were going to do. I think he could have level set. He could have, really pushed the integrity point and said, I'm not going to have anyone in my cabinet.
You're a centrist dad. You're a centrist dad. So you're describing what you wanted him to do. But we're not the people that put Boris Johnson in Downing Street. We're not the people that put Liz Truss in Downing Street. So we're not the people that he needed to win over or persuade or keep in the building. Keep in the building?
But keeping people in the building is not going to win him the election.
Well, it did. The people that won the election... Hang on a minute, champ. The people that won the election in 2019 would categorically, if kept in the building, deliver another election victory in 2024. Of course they would. That's not an opinion, that's counting.
But all the polls were showing that they were hemorrhaging Tory voters. So
and going down our path, coming down centrist, utopia with us, it's not going to keep the red wall or the sort of reform vote that seems to be taking big chunks out of there. Do you see what I mean? You've fallen right into the trap that I only just crawled out of at 10 to 10 this morning.
But I think there's a question of there's the base, there's the Tory base, and then there's the people that he needs to win over to win an election.
Okay. And he's losing both. He's losing the Tory base by not going far enough to the right, and he's losing potential voters from the middle by going too far to the right.
And you've got this issue with Keir Starmer, where actually you've got lots of people voting Labour because they're not Tory. Just what you just said about Sadiq Khan and Susan Hall. There are plenty of people voting Labour because they're not Tory, and he's got a similar issue, Keir Starmer, in terms of actually. Are anyone actually voting positively for Labour, given where the mess the Tories are in? It's a very, very weird political situation that we're in at present. Actually, no one's actually voting for people who they actually want to vote for. It's almost like vote for the lesser evil at the moment. It's a very strange situation.
I encounter some enthusiasm for Keir Starmer, although people struggled then to articulate precisely what it is that they are enthusiastic about. and we come back to your point, which is, well, he's not a Tory. So, that's not necessarily a spectacular political platform. But I disagree with you. I mean, you haven't told me, apart from some nonsense about parachutes. I hate these people who use analogies to try to explain interesting political moments. Apart from some nonsense about parachutes, you haven't actually told me what he could have done differently. Because this is where perhaps even that word you used at the beginning of the conversation, sympathy, begins to kick in. But only sympathy in an unemotional, kind of entirely analytical sense. He's losing votes to the reform people because they're even nastier about refugees than he is, and he's losing votes to the centre or the left because he is so nasty about refugees. I'm speaking very, very loosely. Cost of living, more interest rates, mortgages, all the rest of it, economy. But on that specific issue, which they're trying to oddly keep front and centre, he's damned if he does and damned if he doesn't.
Yep. Yeah, no, I agree. I think integrity would have been the red line, James. My pushback to you would have been if he could have said, look, the Boris Johnson era is gone. No more lying, no more not resigning if you've made a mistake. That goes. If you make a mistake as a cabinet minister, you're out the door. It's as simple as that. Assert his authority. Assert his power. I mean, what was he there? What did he have to lose? I mean, he was only going to be there for 2 years anyway.
I guess that puts us in the tricky position of imagining that even die-hard Boris Johnson fans had somehow developed a desire for or a respect for integrity in the intervening years, which is at the heart of this question. Actually, so it's such a helpful first call because it's really hard to pin down precisely what it is that I'm asking you. Who are the people that Rishi Sunak should have been working harder to woo? We have an arrogance, all of us. Some of us, I grant you, more than others. But we have a certain arrogance in imagining that it's us. Khalid just did it as well. He described what he thinks Rishi Sunak could have done to win him over. And I described what Rishi Sunak could have done to win over a mythical me who would contemplate voting Tory. But actually, that's not going to change the numbers, is it? Is it? Who is it then? Is it the disaffected Tory? The Tory who has been... he needed to swap out the 2019 vote, which was built on Brexit lies, and bring back the traditional, natural Tories who have felt completely alienated, there it is, by the moral corruption of Boris Johnson and the economic incompetence of Liz Truss. And that is where Khalid is right, and I am probably a little bit wrong, because those people possibly would have been persuaded back into the fold by a demonstration of sincerity and genuine integrity. And that probably brings Suella Braverman back into the picture. Chris is in Cowbridge in South Wales. Chris, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. Good to talk to you. By the way, I just wanted to congratulate you on being higher on the UK bestseller chart than Liz Truss's 2,000.
Well, hang on a minute. That's a spoiler alert, isn't it? People like to wait until Sunday before they see this information. Or are you just referring to the online retailer Amazon at this point?
I'm referring to the spectators splashing all over social media that Liz Truss is a UK bestseller at number 70 in the chart, but that's by the by.
And are you suggesting they've been silent about me marching to number 2 in this week's non-fiction paperback charts for all books sold in the entire country? Surely the Spectator have got at least 4 editorials on that marvellous moment in British history, Chris.
I think he's just curious by his absence, don't you?
I digress. What did you actually ring in to do, apart from shower me with love and affection?
Well, in response to your question, is this Rishi Sunak's fault? I'm going to give you a weird answer. It is and it isn't.
Go on.
And I like your car crash analogy. Basically, after Johnson came in, Johnson did everything he could, like that trolley slamming into every side down the aisle, taking the car, smashing the car to pieces. And then basically Liz Truss literally slammed it into a wall, and then they handed over to the runner-up. Let's not forget that. He wasn't the winner of that contest, and then said, here you go, chum, have a go at making a winning car out of that.
Yes,
and then
yes, that's kind of. I like, I nearly slammed on the brakes then for your extraordinary analogy, but it works quite well. He was handed an absolute mess and told, come on then, turn it into a Formula One car.
Exactly. And then he got behind the wheel and then slammed it into reverse and pushed it to the other wall. I mean, his inexperience has been his, I think, greatest enemy. He is his own worst enemy because he comes across a little bit like C-3PO. Everything sounds very scripted and prepared, and it just doesn't feel authentic. And he's literally within hours of standing in an election giving his IPA speech and then puts Suella in, which totally undermines everything he just said. And then he goes on about his 5-point plan or his 5 pledges, and then that doesn't work out, we move on. And the people around him who are advising him obviously are as inexperienced as he is. And it's just one wrong footing or one wrong political move after another. A little bit like Hamza Youssef, who made that, under the quoting him, miscalculation of the human element. So Sunak's obviously got better paid advisors around him, but they're advising him the wrong thing. And it's literally they're just like watching another car crash in reverse, in slow motion, as he makes one bad decision after another. And him going on about his plan at square one, it just...
So you're right. Okay, so he inherited an absolute mess, and he's also really bad at this.
Yeah. I think he's very good at being an exchequer.
I like that, but the question of what could he have done better is still largely unanswered. Chris, thank you. A couple of phone lines free now. 0345 6060973. How much of this is Sunak's fault? And there is a mild consensus that not all of it is, although disagreement on how much of it is. But the question of what he could have done better is one that I'd love to hear you answer. And actually, this has worked in the past. We have somehow managed to create a safe space for disaffected traditional conservatives, people who have voted Tory all their life but have told me on several occasions they won't be able to do so for the foreseeable future. I'd love you to tell me what you think Sunak could have done differently. What are the decisions, the directions that have seen him put ever more space between himself and you? 0345 6060 973. Thomas Watts is here with the headlines. It is 10:35. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the question of how much blame stroke responsibility Rishi Sunak bears for these catastrophic overnight results remains live. And no, the kindest thing I can say, I think, is that he's damned if he does and damned if he doesn't, because if he tacks further to the right, he moves further away from people who would have voted for John Major or David Cameron or possibly Theresa May, actually, depending on how big Brexit was in your brain, and even holding your nose or looking the other way or distracted by your giggles at his cheery bonhomie. You may even have voted for Boris Johnson in 2019 and then come to regret it you voted for Boris Johnson in 2019 because the alternative was Jeremy Corbyn, but you did so in unique and special circumstances. And then, of course, if he goes the other way and moves towards the middle, then support perhaps for the people who promise to be even viler towards refugees, usually an organisation that involves Nigel Farage in some capacity or other, would perhaps secure even more support from the outer fringes of the Tory party. 10:36 is the time. Lenny is in Putney. Lenny, what would you like to say?
Morning, James. First-time caller, big fan, but
Thank
that's
you.
probably because we're on the same political zone, in the same political zone. My thoughts are that you're right, that, I'm not sure this is necessarily what you're saying, but that Sunak is pretty blameless or relatively blameless in the scheme of things. He was dealt an appalling pack of cards by his appalling two predecessors. But the reality is the position goes back to the 2019 election. I'm a lifelong Labour voter, but I'm one of those Labour voters that wasn't prepared to vote for Corbyn for two reasons. His appalling reaction to Brexit, and secondly, his reaction to anti-Semitism. But the reality is the country wasn't prepared to support him because he's a Marxist. He's a perfectly honourable guy, but was never going to become Prime Minister of this country, and the outcome of our election proved to be the case. So it lets in, after 9 years of austerity, an appalling buffoon of a Prime Minister, probably our worst ever, followed by a catastrophic economic collapse, whatever Truss says about the role of the Bank of England. And I think, as Healy said all those years ago, there comes a time in every parliament when the country's had enough. And I don't think there was very much that Sunak could have done. And to make matters worse for him, he's inherited, and what are the Conservatives now? What is conservatism? They are massively split.
What you tell me? Well, I mean, because that's an existential threat. Even when Jeremy Corbyn was leading the Labour Party, I think we had an idea in our heads of what the Labour Party not led by Jeremy Corbyn would look like. Even if it was woolly and to overuse this phrase, centrist, we kind of knew what people like Lammy or Starmer or Yvette Cooper or Ed Balls, although he wasn't in the building anymore, we kind of knew what that party would look like. I have no idea what the post-Sunak Conservative Party looks like.
well, and you and many others, because it's going to split. They're going to seriously veer to the right on one side, and maybe the grand old Conservative Party is finally going to split in the same way that the Libs did with SDP. I mean, I think we're into very, very interesting territory for the Conservatives. Not that I'm that bothered, but of course it's important because of a viable opposition is absolutely central to our democracy.
Yes.
But I think they've got real trouble ahead, and they'll be out for a generation. I can't.
And how much of that is on him?
Oh, very little.
Yeah.
In my view,
I think we're pioneers on this territory. Yes, because traditional analysis focuses on leaders, and of course there'll be lots of talk about getting rid of him in the event of things looking even worse or even awful. But actually, if you were able to turn off any preconceptions or prejudices or loyalties or tribalist impulses, you'd say he couldn't. I mean, unless another snake oil salesman had come along and somehow managed to find another Brexit to sell, it's hard to see how things could have gone any better for anybody else.
I mean, they're baying on the fringes at the moment, and I can imagine that the nutty Tories are about to go for a leadership contest, which is madness. And frankly, if I were him, I'd probably call the election, and my money's on a June election, to be honest.
We shall see. 10:41 is the time. I'd be surprised, but it depends. This lot are so mad now. I mean, talk about cats in a sack. And you just have to think back. It's a party that put Liz Truss in Downing Street. It's a party that put Jacob Rees-Mogg, with support from colleagues, not just the person who made the appointments. Jacob Rees-Mogg became a Secretary of State for Business. Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Secretary of State for... Nadine Dorries, the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport. And those look like the good old days compared to what we've got now. Kemi Badenoch claiming this week that slavery didn't really make any difference to the British economy, that no one really made any money out of it. Just absolute madness. But it's normal. So I don't think you can say, well, look, in a normal world, they're not going to get rid of Rishi Sunak, because the Conservative Party hasn't been a normal world probably since 2019, actually 2016. Ed's in Midhurst. Ed, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. Yes, I think Sunak is largely unresponsible, but there is some blame to shoulder on his side. He is in an environment of impossibility, which you've spoken about already. And to that end, what he may or what he could have done is what I don't think anybody would have been brave enough to do, and that would have been to bring a cabinet of largely centrist politicians and ignoring the ERGs and the Tufton Street cronies in his party.
But that's what you and I would want. What are you? Would you have been a Tory voter at any point? Could you have been?
I'm not party political. I'm fairly agnostic. I look at politics, in the day and on the round.
So you could have done that. So you could have voted for anyone.
Yeah, exactly. I could have voted for anyone, but it's for him, for that party. There's a cancer in the party, and that cancer led to Brexit and various other things that have been wholly unhelpful. And for anyone to get back to traditional Conservative values, I'm surrounded by Conservatives where I am and my family, and I understand their need and want for maintaining, good financial status and where they are. But those days are gone, and they're going to stand a chance of getting back to what the Conservative Party used to look like, a fairly centrist outfit. Someone's going to have to fall on their sword, and I don't think anyone at the moment is brave enough to do so.
Yeah. Well, bravery or madness. No one's quite mad enough to do so. I like that. But again, that would have appealed to you, and I see you as an unweighted pendulum. You wanted to see a move away from the sort of moral horror show represented by Suella Braverman. Of course, people who are tempted towards the reform vote, and indeed Suella Braverman herself already condemning the voluntary patriation, if you like, of a failed asylum seeker to Rwanda, by pointing out it has absolutely nothing to do with her dream of dragging people there against their will. That sees everything tack in the opposite direction. It is coming up to 10:45. Professor Sir John Curtice. It's a national requirement now. I think legislation has been passed that Professor Sir John Curtice has to appear on every discussion programme in the country in the aftermath of a major ballot, a major vote. He is, of course, the Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde and a polling expert. And he's always absolutely fascinating to listen to. And you can listen to him after this. It's 10:48. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Professor Sir John Curtice, polling expert and Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde, joins me, as is a legal requirement for every conversation on the radio or television about electoral results in the immediate aftermath of any ballot. And it occurred to me, John, if you don't mind me asking, I traditionally, I think like many others, I'd introduce you as the doyen of political polling. When did you achieve that status? It feels like you've always had it, but there must have come a point where you sort of reflected on the fact that you'd become
it's crept up somewhere.
The biggest cheese in the polling expert deli. Do we know? Is there a date, a year, an election?
I think it's probably it might be the first election where the exit poll, which of course I'm kind of a bit of the spokesperson for, kind of said something in slightly contradiction to what people were expecting and proved to be rather closer to the truth. I think it's kind of that together with the 2014 independence referendum, which of course is my backyard, is probably the two signal events. But anyway.
And here we are. Where does this one sit in the sort of pantheon of recent results?
Well, there's one way of presenting what happened last night as rather dull and rather boring.
Yes.
In that, well, yet again, the Conservatives suffer a record swing to Labour in a parliamentary by-election. But hey, it's happened 5 times in this parliament now. So what's new? The Conservatives basically, in terms of their share of the vote, roughly where they were last year, maybe even slightly weaker, but not a dramatic change for any of the parties from 12 months ago. That's more or less what the polls have been saying. And hey, what's new? Actually, the one thing that is new is that, as the polls have been suggesting, Reform are now stronger. That was indicated by them nearly getting second place in the Blackpool South by-election. It's also there in the limited number of wards in which they fought the local elections. But, they were getting about 11% of the vote typically, and that was where the Reform stood, was where some of the Conservatives' worst performances were. So that's one recent development. But otherwise, it's more of the same, but that means it's more of the same relatively bad news for the Conservative Party.
Yes, and impossible to unpick how much traction is caused by enthusiasm for Labour as opposed to disillusionment with Conservatives.
Indeed. I mean, to be honest, to track that, you've really got to look at the timeline. I mean, my own view is that if you look at the timeline, there are basically 2 signal events. One is Boris Johnson and the first revelations about Partygate in December 2021, and the second is the Liz Truss fiscal event. I mean, these are 2 events in the immediate wake of which Conservative support fell away heavily, never really recovered, and between them have been sufficient, more or less, together with the persistent bad economic position, to account for where the Conservatives are at. And I would certainly take the view that while Sir Keir Starmer has done changes to his party, might have done enough to make it an acceptable vehicle of protest, that basically the Conservatives' mistakes are much more important than Sir Keir Starmer's transformation of his party and explaining why we are where we are now.
And is there any clear, conceivable way in which Rishi Sunak could have done better, could have done differently?
Well, I mean, that raises an interesting question. I mean, Tim Montgomery, the former founder of Conservative Home, which is the Tory members' website, was very critical of what happened last night in the overnight coverage, and basically was calling for Rishi Sunak to be defenestrated, and that the Conservative, he's come to the conclusion that Mr. Sunak doesn't have what's required to turn things around, and that the party needs to find another leader. Now, an alternative interpretation is to say, well, basically, the legacy that Mr. Sunak was bequeathed by Liz Truss was so toxic that nobody was going to turn it round. I mean, after all, no government that has presided over a market crisis of the kind that occurred in the wake of the fiscal event has ever survived at the ballot box. This was the first time that a party had changed its leader and the Prime Minister in the wake of that calamity. But the lesson perhaps is that changing the leader doesn't get you around that calamity either, though of course it's certainly fair to say that perhaps it is quite remarkable that Rishi Sunak's personal popularity, which was much better than that of his party when he first became Prime Minister, is now he's now as unpopular as his party, and his party's not recovered at all.
And it is possibly, as a couple of my callers this morning have suggested, an existential crisis for the Conservative Party, but too early to say. Not too early for you, in conclusion, Sir John, to tell us what this might teach us about the general election when it...
Well, look, the first thing I should say, James, is right. Local people don't always vote in the same way in local elections as they do in general elections, and that's point one. Point two is local elections tell you where we are now. It's another way of measuring where we are now. They are not a forecasting tool. They do not necessarily tell you where we're going to be in the autumn. What they do tell you, these local elections, the fact that there hasn't been any change, that the Labour Party is way ahead and the Conservative Party is, suffering these very high parliamentary by-election swings, is that unless things do change, the Conservatives do seem to be heading for a serious defeat in the general election. But it's an if statement, it's not a prediction, but it does underline how time seems to be running out for the Conservatives, and that so far, basically, the Rishi Sunak project of turning things around has very little to show for itself. And you can understand the nervousness of Tory MPs about what fate is about to befall their party.
Indeed you can. Any chance of a surprise in London?
It would be astonishing. I mean, Sadiq Khan is not as popular as his party.
No.
But London
which is rare for a mayor, isn't it? The relationship between mayoral popularity and party popularity, I think almost everywhere else, is actually the other way round.
Well, no. I mean, it depends on what you're talking about. I mean, Mr. Burnham. You're right.
True.
You're right. Sadiq is unusual as an incumbent in
Yes.
having a negative. You're absolutely right.
That's a relief.
Of course, that means that in Tees Valley, which we will get later on today, and the West Midlands tomorrow, in truth is if the Tories hang on to either or both of those, it will tell you more about the popularity of the gentleman concerned rather than telling you anything about the prospects for the Conservative Party.
Sir John Curtice, doyen of pollsters. I probably should stop saying that, but thank you very much indeed. Always a genuine pleasure to hear your insights. And now we go. It's also a genuine pleasure always to hear yours as well, which is why the phone lines are open. And the number you need is 0345 6060973. That suggestion there, I wasn't familiar with the analysis from the fellow that the Conservative Home fella, but that these are Tories who've been engaging in circular firing squads now for the best part of 5 years. So what we need is another circular firing squad, is possibly inevitable take on it. Slightly more nuanced analysis would suggest that you need somebody to come forward who can do what appears to be the impossible, to unite the Suella Braverman wing of the party with the Tom Tugendhat wing of the party. And that seems to be impossible. And I don't mean in the context of Parliament, I mean in the context of the country. Which is why I would repeat my appeal for somebody who would describe themselves as a traditional Tory voter, and where you stand on Sunak, and how you could be tempted back into your own traditional fold. Teresa is in Faversham. Teresa, what would you like to say?
Oh, hello.
Hello.
I was just wanting to say what I thought about Rishi Sunak.
Oh, yes.
Because I just cannot believe in any sense that he is not to blame, not entirely, because obviously the party was dreadful and had already lost all sense of morality before he came along. But what happened was he didn't change that. He continued with that. And instead of, like he said, standing on the doorstep of 10 Downing Street that he was going to change everything. We all know that didn't happen. Well, he could have done that. He could have made sure that everything that he did was in the best interest of the country, and that he was actually there with that position to change things and make the country better. And obviously he wasn't going to solve all the problems.
So what could he have done then?
Well, I mean, for one thing, he could have acted in an honest way. He could have told the country, I'm here to make things better, and that's what I'm going to do. And then he could have the policies that he's tried to implement. Some of them he's got through, some of them he hasn't. They've not been in the best interest of the country. I mean, for example, we all know, don't we, the Rwanda scheme. That's not in the best interest of anybody.
No, but there's no earthly way Rishi Sunak could have abandoned the Rwanda scheme. Or is there? I mean, could he have just said to the nasty wing of the party, why don't you all clear off with 30p Lee and join that funny fella over at the party where Farage is the majority shareholder? I mean, could that have actually changed the... How much of the party would that have involved?
Yeah, but if he was... genuine about wanting to do the best for the country, that is exactly what he would have done. And I think, and I feel quite strongly about it.
I can tell you do.
I'd like somebody to tell me, something different that would change my mind, but I haven't heard. He did not particularly come into politics for the best interest of the country. Now,
no.
That's been a long time now since that's happened, hasn't it, unfortunately? And Brexit, I blame for that, because you got Boris Johnson telling all those massive lies, knowing exactly what he was doing, knowing exactly what devastation...
Yeah, but you can't. But the people who believed those lies aren't really ready to be rehabilitated, are they? So this is why I have more sympathy for Sunak in an intellectual, not an emotional sense than you do, because he's brought it all on himself. But I have more intellectual sympathy for him than you do, because I don't see what he could have... I mean, if he'd done what you describe, then the party might be in an even worse position, but you'd be happier.
Well, the thing is, I believe that the party would be in a better position, because what they've done is they've treated British people as though they're stupid. And I don't know if I'm sure I'm not the only one, because I've spoken to other people. I feel actually embarrassed and ashamed. If I'm abroad... and I say I'm British, I think, oh, God, because it's a shame on us all, what they've been doing. They've broken the ministerial code how many times? They just do it.
Doesn't matter anymore.
All the time now.
Yeah.
There's no morality. There's nothing, that you can say is no integrity anymore. And there's none. And Rishi Sunak, you see, I think, now this is my opinion, and I haven't got any...
no, of course. We've got as much as anybody else has.
I believe that Rishi Sunak is motivated by money only. And I think a lot of people are like that.
And prestige, Teresa. Don't underestimate press, because he's got loads of money. And if he was lying in bed at night wondering what was missing from his personal arsenal, status would be on the list. Status and public approbation.
Well, see, I'm not sure about that.
No?
No, I don't know. I think it's more money. Because I know he's extremely wealthy, but when you think about it, what he's done since he's been in government is the biggest achievement that he's had is making his family even richer. They've managed to get contracts for Infosys from all kinds of public sector roles, and that's what he focuses on. Now, I read that he gets up early and he works all day until late at night.
He's not a lumberjack.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. No, I don't think he would be a lumberjack, would he? He probably wouldn't be able to lift much. Anyway, I'm not going to be rude.
Teresa, honestly, wash your mouth out. You've taken me way past the news because I was enjoying listening to you so much. I'd completely lost track of time. Thank you, Teresa. I'd not a lot of sympathy for him then. A fairly lonely battle that I'm fighting this morning, but it's not without, I think, evidential heft. 11:01 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. It is 5 minutes after 11. Teresa, I think quite rightly, garnering an awful lot of support. I'll tell you what, Teresa, if you ran for office, I think you'd romp home. An awful lot of admiration and support for your points and your thinking, albeit that it's still, I think, is susceptible to the kind of perspective problem. You describe what you wanted him to do in the belief that that would deliver a better result. But it would at least deliver a better political landscape if he abandoned some of the worst excesses of his predecessors, whether incompetence in Liz Truss's case or something more abstract and ugly in Boris Johnson's case. Certainly the sort of wooing or the weaponising of really ugly ideas that Suella Braverman represents. Then public discourse would have improved, but we've learnt in recent years that when proper politicians attempt to stick to the facts, stick to the truth, sanitise public discourse, then old Nigel will pop up in the wings, hoovering up all the people who relish the unpleasantness and the bigotries and the prejudices. And that, I think, is the closest I got to a breakthrough in that hour. There's just the idea that they can't do anything until they stop wooing the same people that far-right parties are wooing, or extremely right-wing parties are wooing. One of the Reform people was talking about his comfort at watching refugees drown in the sea the other day, and then denying that he'd said it, even though the tape was in front of people. So that may be, and how far off is that day? Someone sits down in Conservative Central Office and says, we've got to stop going after, essentially, the Brexit rump. We've got to stop going after that Brexit rump and start actually chasing. I mean, think about young people for a minute. I haven't seen any demographic breakdowns, but the Reform Party, which I told you was going to start doing well because of the amount of attention that the media was giving it. You're a Green Party politician who's dedicated your entire life to public duty, like Caroline Lucas, who was a guest on Full Disclosure recently. You must sit there looking at, and here's Richard Tice, you must sit there thinking, but why are they getting so much attention? Here's Nigel Farage using his Question Time season ticket, and you're a Liberal Democrat MEP, for example, 10 years ago, with just as big a mandate that he has. Why do the media give these people from the right, further right than the Conservative Party? You may not be comfortable with the phrase far right, but you can't argue with further right, or even further right than the Conservative Party. You can come in and have half an hour behind the microphone if you want, but I haven't seen a Green MEP in this studio for a million years. It's strange, isn't it? Not just this studio, but all of them. And so when do the Conservatives get back into what you might call electable territory? When they jettison all the things that made them electable in 2019. And that's really weird politically. That's really, really weird, because the scale of that victory is intoxicating. We just need a bit more Boris. We just need a bit more Brexit. We just need this and we just need that. But actually, the people brought on board by that were conned. So you keep chasing the sort of stop the boats crew. They're insatiable. That's an unfillable chasm. However vile you are, even if we started publicly executing refugees, someone would be popping up to the right of the people publicly executing refugees and claiming that we're too soft on them, claiming that we need to bring back disemboweling, hanging's too good for them. Do you see what I mean? That impulse that some people feel activated when Farage starts rubbing his thighs in Dover with his Fisher-Price binoculars, looking at desperate people facing death in boats. And then a few years later, people like James Cleverly, previously close to respectable, starts abandoning his own conviction that the idea is absolutely bonkers and pretending instead that it's both sensible and humane. That's when the madness becomes potentially terminal. I think. I could be wrong. But then you look at Trump and you think, no, actually, let's just be even more disgusting. That could be the key difference between the United Kingdom and America, in that let's be even more disgusting model doesn't really work here. But then we've never had anyone who is as, quotes, good, end quotes, at it as Donald Trump. We've never had a demagogue of quite that. It's a combination of his perceived wealth as opposed to being a sort of failed city spiv or someone who inherited. People think because of The Apprentice that Donald Trump is some sort of business genius. The Apprentice, of course, is a reality television show and therefore, by definition, not reflective of reality. But that's what people say. That unique combination of circumstances created a space in which the promise to be ever more disgusting towards other people, whoever they may be, became irresistible for enough people to deliver electoral success. Now, I don't think that could happen here. I suppose the most obvious candidate would be Suella Braverman, possibly Kemi Badenoch. Honest Bob Jenrick trying to become that kind of character, but none of them, I don't think, possessed of the sort of unique, sinister alchemy that bubbles away within Donald Trump's curiously coloured head. 11 minutes after 11. So, I mean, staying with the Sunak question, but let's broaden it out now into the Conservatives. question of why is Sunak so bad at this? That's possibly the question that Theresa has prompted. Let's put that on the board. Why is Sunak so bad at politics? Or what is it about him that makes you conclude that he's just awful? 0345 606 0973. But let's have a look at that. And again, I issue my invitation to what you would call disillusioned or traditional conservatives who can't conceive of voting for them in the current space. Are they done for? I mean, as a parliamentary party, what on earth are the Conservatives going to look like after the general election? If the results in the general election are in any way reflective of what has gone on in the locals overnight, or indeed if the Blackpool South by-election is in any way indicative of what's likely to happen in the so-called Red Wall, what on earth is going to happen to... Go on, put your thinking caps on and tell me what on earth is going to happen to the Conservative Party when we finally limp over the general election touchline. Let's go to Reading. Patrick's there. Patrick, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. How are you?
Very well, mate. What's on your mind?
So I'm going to try and answer your kind of three positive questions. So I think with regards to kind of what's going wrong and etc., I think it's a combination of kind of 4 or 5 things. So one, so John Curtice was actually on the news earlier, and he mentioned the general apathy of a party being in for a decade and a half. I think that is a factor that people need to consider. I think that leans into the whole aspect of trust and Boris and stuff like that.
It does, and it doesn't have to. There's not an inevitability to it, but there comes a point where you think they've had so many goes now. Yeah, they've been there for so long. But that's, anyway, crack on.
Yeah, and as I said, I think that dovetails into kind of the whole aspect of trust and Johnson and even Cameron as well, just his the austerity, etc. And then I do think the Jeremy Corbyn factor, him not being there anymore, and that kind of goes hand in glove with Keir Starmer changing the
underestimated, and so many people were so unhappy with these statistics. But Jeremy Corbyn was the single main reason why Labour voters didn't vote Labour in 2019. Yeah. It wasn't Boris Johnson; it was Jeremy Corbyn. So that's been missing from our analysis today.
I think as well, like the thing you said about a party being in for a decade and a half. There's so many goes. He had 2 goes, and it didn't work. So that's the proofs in the pudding. Like I said, Keir Starmer has changed the Labour Party. They are clearly more electable. I think his leadership, if in comparison to Sunak, and this will lead me on to kind of answering the second and third questions that you just posited, like if something goes wrong with someone in the Labour Party, he acts very quickly. Now, I think there could be arguments to be saying that he's acted too quickly on certain stuff. I think most recently around certain comments regarding what's happening in Israel, Gaza, etc. But he is quick, and he's like, no, let's just get the conversation about what we're going to do next, as opposed to leaving it sit and it festering, etc. And like everyone said, and Theresa was absolutely amazing, and I think she's kind of hit upon something that I wanted to comment on about Sunak. He's just generally very bad at this.
Yes, he is, isn't he?
I think Theresa kind of highlighted something which I wanted to articulate more, which was, I think he's one of those people similar to Cameron who was just like, well, I think I'd be very good at being PM. I think he wants to tell people he is being Prime Minister, as opposed to, like, I'd love to be able to get in a room with these people and say, like, what are you going to do as Prime Minister? Why do you want to be it? As opposed to, I'd be very good, or I can tell people I was Prime Minister. It's like,
I always thought that was a significant moment, a much more significant moment than history. I mean, some people, you included, obviously, really picked up on that. But I find that staggering. Going to a school like mine, I don't find it as staggering as I would if I'd gone to a normal school. We are imbued with a sense of entitlement, and when you've spent your whole life being privileged, equality feels like oppression and all of those things. But he literally did say, for people who are confused by your reference, he literally said, when asked why he wanted to be Prime Minister, his literal answer was, well, I think I'd be rather good at it, which is incredible, right? And yet, at the same time, utterly unsurprising.
Yeah, and with regards to Sunak being really bad at it, I think the most obvious one is the kind of situation with Suella Braverman. I think prior to him even bringing her back, like, there's the whole aspect of them making a deal, which he referenced in with her resignation, or I say essay, it wasn't really a letter. And like the aspect of saying, well, I've done to you something, you get me my job, but also like there was the multiple kind of occasions prior to that which he was going against kind of party lines or just saying awful stuff, and he just wasn't doing anything about it. I also think a factor that hasn't been kind of considered would be he's being attacked on multiple sides, but he's doing nothing about it. Like obviously being attacked by Labour with regards to their base and not their base, like the general sort of voters that are voting for them. The Lib Dems obviously are coming after people that are in that coalition as well. But I think with reform, I think Sunak has actually made it a lot worse than he should have, or could have, because he's generally quite bad at this. I think the debanking thing that Farage been shut up about, if Sunak had just not given him the attention, then it goes away. Like Farage, he can go around to all these studios and stuff. And I know you say it so eloquently about the fact he's just got a season ticket to all these places. If Sunak doesn't give it the sunlight, then it doesn't become a factor. And I think to answer... Well,
that's what I meant when I said they've got to stop chasing those Brexit stop the boats people that Uncle Nige is the sort of patron saint of. Yeah,
and I think really quickly, because I know we're past...
Go on, crack on, well done.
But final thing would be, I think what happens next is that a deal with the Reform Party happens after the election, not before. And I think,
although Reform keep insisting that could never happen, since when could you take anything that Nigel Farage had said with anything other but a large pinch of salt? Patrick, that's first-class analysis. A lot of very kind messages coming in about the quality of the callers today. I am a mere vessel through which they pass for your illumination and delectation. But Teresa and Patrick and everybody else doing us all very proud today. I do, however, the problem is that, of course, there's loads of people waiting to answer the questions I've already asked, and then like a very annoying schoolboy, I start asking more questions. Why, Dad? Why? But I do want to know what we think the future holds for a Conservative Party that currently contains both Suella Braverman and... Who would you say now? Let's do that as a WhatsApp as we head towards a little hiatus. Who would you say? So I use Suella Braverman as the example of one extreme of the Conservative Party. In terms of serving MPs in the Commons, so you can't have Ken Clarke or Rory Stewart or anyone like that. If I offer you Suella Braverman as the extreme right of the Conservative Party, who's at the opposite end of the Conservative Party? Send me your suggestions for that one now. You can 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need for WhatsApp, or you can, of course, text 84850. 11:18 is the time. 21 after 11 is the time. Ollie's been in touch. How much different do you think things would have been if Sunak had been honest about the situation he was taking over? He seems to come in the first moment up until now would talk about everything being rosy and okay. When Keir Starmer took over, the first thing he did was lay out the issues in his own party and explain how he would address them. That's quite interesting. But I don't think that... Well, maybe Sunak could. Could you, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, Keir Starmer held senior roles under Jeremy Corbyn? Can you then arrive in the big job and say, right, we've got some Augean stable level cleaning up to do, lads? I think you could, actually. I think I agree with Ollie. I thought that he might have a go at that. In the very, very early hours of his premiership. I was obviously very, very wrong. 22 minutes after 11 is the time. You sometimes, you're very unfair to me. Because or maybe I've asked the question wrong. I can't tell whether you're being serious now with your suggestions on if Suella Braverman is on the extreme right of the Tory party, who would be on the opposite end of the spectrum. So I'm talking about One Nation Tories or centrists or wets, if you like, I think, as Margaret Thatcher called them, or liberal conservatives. Quite a few suggestions for Tobias Ellwood, for example, which I think is fairly sound, although, of course, he had to resign as chair of the Defence Select Committee after calling for more engagement with the Taliban. But some of the suggestions, Gillian Keegan is a suggestion. The problem is it's so hard to keep up with who's going to be there after the next election, isn't it? I think Ellwood is. But I just thought for a minute I was going mad because 4 or 5 suggestions that Philip Davis should be on that list, who's married to Esther McVeigh, I think. But then I saw it's the same person sending it 5 times, so you're obviously trolling me, and I busted you, so stop it. So who would be there? Who would be the opposite to a woman whose nickname is, I think, fairly or unfairly, Cruella? Who would be the nice Tory that you would point to as the sort of opposite pole to a Suella Braverman character? 23 minutes after 11 is the time. Phil's in Worksop. Phil, what would you like to say?
Wow, isn't the Tory party different compared to what it used to be a few years ago? I mean, oh my goodness me. I don't even know where to start. I mean, I go and look at the coalition government, for example, with David Cameron and Nick Clegg, and I remember the big society. Do you know what I'm on about when I say that, James, right?
Yes.
He was giving that speech of, together we need to be in it, and it's only going to work if we come together and work together. You can't imagine Rishi Sunak saying any of that now, because it seems to be that divisiveness wins. It's hey, let's say something controversial about trans people, or let's say something controversial about immigrants, because we want to attract that kind of market. And it's actually really sad, because you're losing those, if you like, sensible Tory voters to just absolute nonsense, if I'm honest. It just seems to be stop the boats. I couldn't have imagined that being a tagline for the Tory party a few years ago. And stop the boats, it's meaningless. It's actually quite offensive, in my opinion, as well. I mean, more focus is needed on the cost of living crisis. I think if he'd have gone into the election going, hey, we know things are pretty bad right now, the economy is not great, but we have got a plan to make this better, I actually think they would have picked up a lot more of the sensible Tory vote, in my opinion.
Yeah, but it would have involved... Well, how much denigration of what went before would that have involved? Because, I mean, the problem with someone like Braverman is he tries to keep her sweet and she stings him anyway.
Oh, it really is silly. I mean, somebody must be advising him to say all of this stuff. There must be, the party sort of consensus, hey, we've done data on X, Y, Z. But we know that immigration, yes, okay, people talk about it all the time, but it isn't the hot topic that it's being made out to be. It's like, people are really worried about their local jobs, their lives, and whether they're going to have any disposable income or any income at all, for that matter. And They should focus on that.
Yeah, I mean, you make it sound bleeding obvious, Phil, if you don't mind me saying so. I mean, what are you going to do? What are you going to do?
It seems like they just seem to be, wanting to take the reform vote, which I kind of understand, but then that is a vote that's only short-lived, isn't it?
Yeah.
Things turn around.
And then something else will pop up. There'll be some other, whether it's disabled people or unemployed people, or they'll just find another section of humanity to other and demonise, and the new person to the right of the Tory party will start insisting that all our problems are down to all the money that we give in sickness benefit or something like that. So again, this is emerging, isn't it, as a theory or a thesis that they have to stop. It's like their head. Did you have an Action Man when you were young with eagle eyes?
Yes.
So it's as if their eagle eyes Action Man is stuck facing in one direction. They can only look to the right. They've completely forgotten how to look to the left.
They have indeed. I mean, even my family, which are a family of conservative voters, as a rule, they are now going, they're a bit dodgy. And I am surprised. I mean, I was the kind of rebellious one. I do vote very differently to my family, sure. In that I vote, Liberal Democrat usually. And, I know that, sometimes that's a losing vote around here, but I know how hard the team work. And that's the point of politics. We kind of made it a political thing of, you can only vote for one or the other. And it's so hard for people, who are actually decent and are not career politicians to actually get heard and stand in a democratic process,
Indeed. Phil, I'm keeping the bar very, very high. Quality. I'm feeling that I'm the weak link in the programme today. The callers are much better at this than the presenter is. I'm not sure why. Somebody told me earlier that it wasn't working on the phones doing analysis of the overnight election stuff. But hey, we're rule breakers in this slot. Rule breakers, not rule takers. There are rumours afoot in Tees Valley. Emily Craigie, LBC's reporter in the northeast, is there. Have you been there all night, Emily? Would you like me to send up some espresso?
No, I've been very lucky. I've just been here since this morning, so feeling, very fresh-faced.
Good.
But yes, we're expecting a result here very soon.
And I read somewhere that Labour had already conceded.
Yeah, we've been hearing rumours all week, and Labour have been briefing out, I think, to, avoid a big shock on election day, that it's looking like Ben Houchen's going to win for a third term. Now, we've had two sort of results from council areas and already, and Ben Houchen has won both of those. So it is looking like he is on track for that third term.
Well, do we know what he's done right that Tories elsewhere in the country appear to have done wrong?
I think for him, he's got a huge profile in this area. So it's partly to do with that. And also, there's been Labour criticism that he's not necessarily put that he's Conservative front and centre on his election materials. So maybe that's come into it as well.
Literally, hard to tell from some of the pamphlets, some of the leafleting, what party he is nominally representing completely.
Yeah, but he's, I actually asked him that question earlier, and he's come out and said, he's a proud Conservative. People know he's a Conservative here, because, Labour have made that very clear to voters.
Final question, Emily, because we'll probably catch up with you when the result is finalised. Does he have any political ambitions beyond the North East, beyond the Tees Valley?
We've asked him that question sort of time and time again.
I'm sure you have.
Yeah, and he says no. He says the Tees
Do
Valley
you believe him? Do you believe him as a keen watcher of North East politics?
Well, the thing is, isn't he? He's in the Lords. Boris Johnson gave him that position.
Yeah,
so, if he didn't win here, then we might have seen him cropping up more in London.
Indeed. Emily Craigie, many thanks. LBC's reporter in the North East, live at that mayoral vote, as I mentioned, to which we will no doubt return if the final result drops on our watch. There won't be a result in London, I don't think. Is it tomorrow? The London Met? We don't know until tomorrow. What are they doing? Why can't they start counting? It's ridiculous. Probably all watching telly or something. But the suggestion by a beloved former colleague that there might be a surprise for Sadiq Khan in the result, I do feel as my morning espresso wears off, I do feel that's increasingly fanciful. I just wish he was here for me to tease. Thomas Watts is here with the headlines. 11:34 is the time. Lewis Goodall joining me in just after 10 minutes or so to cast his expert eye over events overnight. Lewis, of course, becoming a particularly shiny jewel in our weekend scheduled crown on Sunday morning. We speak quite disparagingly about 30p Lee and his mates, so we should take a moment to congratulate Reform UK on their results. They have secured 0 councils and, at the moment, 0 councillors. But here they are all over your media, nonetheless, popping up soon on a phone-in near you. That's 0 councils and 0 councillors, as things stand. Whether that's likely to change in the course of the day, I do not know, but what an odd country we are, eh? Tom's in Winchester to steer us back to the broader question of Conservatives. Tom, what would you like to say?
Good morning. I left the Conservative Party membership and voting for them in 2016 over your favourite referendum.
Yes.
Ironically, that's when I started listening to yourself. I would vote Conservative again. I haven't voted Conservative since that day, but there's a few steps that I would take. If I was to try and appeal to people like myself, if I was Rishi Sunak, I would look to, for a start, the mayors. So, with Andy Street in Birmingham, he's got a very positive brand locally because he's not been a complete Fruit Loop and he's almost distanced himself from the party in Westminster. And to give them credit, people like Sadiq Khan and Andy Burnham also are positive mayors for their areas. I think the whole mayoral thing's been a very positive thing for the UK in general. I would remove the red wall Tories. I think nearly all of them have been utterly useless to the brand. I think all they've done is cause more issues than positives. With the election looming, I'd look to stuff like PR, the proposition,
yes,
split the party in half, get rid of the right wing. I'm quite extreme with my views on this because I'm just sick of what they've done to the brand.
Just to be clear, you're quite extreme in your views about the state of the Conservative Party. You're not extreme in your views about the kind of policies that are part of the corruption of your old party. You're not a Suella Braverman type of extreme. You're a we really need some serious change type of extreme.
Yeah, David Cameron coming back was something I actually saw positively because he isn't a complete and utter deranged idiot.
No, but that's a low bar.
I know.
What is it that you like about David Cameron? Well, he's not a complete and utter deranged idiot, although his arrogance, hubris and entitlement brought us to the point that this conversation began, brought us to Brexit, and arguably brought us to that defeat.
But I think if I was to look at, and I agree with that point, but I think if I was to stop talking about the boats, I think remove the whips and stop having people
really
like Priti Patel.
Yeah, this is really interesting, isn't it? So I'm very pleased with my Eagle Eyes Action Man analogy. I don't know if you heard it. Did you have an Action Man when you were young?
I did have one as well, yeah.
So if you got a matchstick, if you moved the eyes so they were looking to the right and then shoved a matchstick in there with a bit of super glue, you'd never be able to move them back again. That's the Conservative Party, that is. They cannot look anywhere except further to the right than where they currently are.
And if Action Man turned to the left, they'd see people like me literally holding their hands up, pleading to come back to where they were.
Yes.
And I think that's where I'm just dismayed by it, because I will never vote Labour. That's my views, and I'm entitled to those views.
Of course you are. Don't be so defensive.
Yeah,
although I was about to ask you why. Why could you not vote for a centrist, Keir Starmer-led Labour Party, Tom?
Well, for a start, because of I've got a proposition that I'd like to see the PR and split the party in half. Yeah. And part of the problem is where I live in Winchester, I don't think Labour would even try to
so it's constituency specific rather than national policy based.
I said to your producer that I would only now vote for a party that would be positively talking about rejoining the customs union for a start. Like I struggle to believe that Keir Starmer will go through 5 years without having to just start to persuade the country to say, look, this is an utterly ridiculous situation that we're, as you've said so many times, cut our toes off, and we're just sort of like milling around looking for the toes in the sea, and we can't find them. But instead, we're just focusing on boats and talking about like Rwanda, and just like I just don't understand how the country. Well, I've read your books, but I don't understand how the country has fallen so far so quickly.
Hang on a minute, that's not the kind of endorsement I'm looking for. That's exactly what I explained in the most recent. Well, it touches on some of the things you've just described. I think the biggest thing, and this does go back to 2016, was probably a detachment from the observable realities around us, and the Conservative Party, oddly, whether consciously or unconsciously, and I think Liz Truss watched Boris Johnson and thought, oh, that's how you do it. You just lie. You just talk jibber jabber, and
if Starmer did one thing, I'd vote for him. If Starmer said on day one of a government, I will produce a legislation that means that Liz Truss does not get her Prime Minister's salary for the rest of her life, I'd vote for Keir Starmer, because she's destroyed the Conservative brand more than Rishi Sunak ever will be able to.
Yeah. No,
the only thing I'd finally say, is with Rishi Sunak, if I was him in his situation, the only thing I think that the EU alignment he's got no chance of doing, even though I'd love him to do it. The only thing I look back to was 2021 when they came out the initial parts of the pandemic, and there was the vaccine bounce. But one of the things that people forget is that Rishi Sunak came out and raised the national insurance for the NHS and care sector, and the ratings for the Tories then was sublime. They were miles ahead of Labour, and they were in government after 12 years. If he turned around tomorrow and said, look, scrap these tax cuts, the whole country's in an absolute... He won't say they're in a whole mess, but if he said, look, we need to focus on the NHS and the care sector to help people, I think, again, he's got a chance of wooing voters back. But I can't see the Tories being in power again at this rate. I can't, not in my lifetime. I can't see.
I'm wary of hyperbole, but I don't know if this is hyperbole. Because of that problem we have in imagining, is why you're suggesting that the party needs to split in two, and then you can imagine what both halves would look like. But imagining both halves surviving under one umbrella is impossible. And imagine either half triumphing electorally in a first-past-the-post system is also impossible. This is existential then, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the only other thing is I always say there's three parts to Conservatives. They talk about this ridiculous families thing, that drives me up the wall. But the thing I always think is there's three parts to the Tory family. There's the kind of right wing, which is Braverman, Patel, Farage, all these other, because Reform really are just a push button for the Conservatives to go further right. I don't think they actually serve any other purpose.
No, they don't. And that's when we're back to the matchstick wedged in the eagle-eyed action man, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think you've got the central Liberal Conservatives like myself, I would happily vote for a Liberal Conservative Prime Minister tomorrow.
Name one.
Also got the Red Wall.
Name one.
Ken Clarke?
No, you can't have him. Someone who's actually in the current parliamentary party.
It's a tough one, isn't it?
It is.
Tobias Ellwood.
Yeah, Caroline Noakes is getting quite a lot of love.
My local Conservative MP, Steve Bryan, he's all right. He's actually all right, and that's probably about as positive as I get at the moment, because
fair enough.
Boris Johnson kicked them all out.
So is he better than? He's not a complete. What did you say about David Cameron? A complete gibbering idiot.
Fruit Loo, one of them.
Yeah,
I've got a lot of work to say about David Cameron.
We need like a colour chart, a Dulux colour chart with complete gibbering Fruit Loop at one end, and then for you, Steve Bryan. The other one, Greg Clark, I'm getting on my list. Robert Buckland.
I do stay in the loop of the Conservative Party because I've been, loyal to the Conservative Party for so long. But I can't picture a way of which this ever goes anything other than it's over.
No, I can't either. Well, that's the next topic. That's the next topic. Yeah, unless they bring in PR. But who would bring in PR if they had literally just won an election off the back of a first past the post? Tom, brilliant stuff. I know I keep saying it, but this just is one of those days where I can't believe how lucky I am to have by far the best listeners and callers in the history of phone-in radio in the United Kingdom. Do you know why I said that? Partly, A, because it's true, but B, because I said a moment ago, I don't really like hyperbole. But I have the best callers in the history of phone-in radio. Wait for it, in any language, not just in English. You think there's some old Serbo-Croat phone-in show out there where they've got better callers than me? Well, you've got another think coming. I think we might open up Idiot's Corner, although this could be a joke that I don't get from Carl. Has just listened to Tom provide, I thought, a singing critique of the Conservative Party's current travails. But Carl's been in touch to say, this guy isn't a Conservative, he's a socialist. He's not fooling me. They walk among us. It's coming up to 11:45. Lewis Goodall joining us after this. 11:47 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the existential threat that the Conservative Party is under has grown in heft, if you like, over the course of this conversation. And that's why I think calls like Tom are particularly valuable on a day like today. For a number of reasons. Number one, to remove any fears of echo chambery style analysis. I'm looking for people who, like Tom, can say, I can't imagine myself ever voting Labour, whether for reasons of geography, constituency geography, whether for reasons of sort of tribalism, whether for reasons of political principle, whatever the reason may be, the people that the Tory party needs to win back, I can't quite see a clear path to an explanation of who they are and how they do it, because a party that contains Suella Braverman at one extreme, and it's hard, as we just established, to find brilliant examples of current parliamentarians. You could say Rory Stewart or David Gauke even, but they're not there anymore. They got slung out by Dominic Cummings. And therefore, what are you even talking about when you talk about a Tory party post next election, when and indeed if it ever actually happens? Alicia Kearns, for people interested in such matters, and I am, is also getting talked about a lot. She's been very strong on the Middle East, apparently, so maybe she could be filed under sensible. Lewis Goodall is with us. Lewis, as you know, is starting a new show on this radio station on Sunday. Does it have a name, Lewis?
It's very imaginative, James, yes. And you'll understand we took a long time to come up with it. It's called Sunday with Lewis Goodall.
Is that why you had to move from Fridays?
Well, we decided that it wouldn't really work on Fridays. We went through the full iteration of every other day of the week, and we decided that Sunday was the apposite place.
It's a natural home for Sunday with Lewis Goodall.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. And it is in the plum slot. It's the 10 a.m. slot.
10 till 12 from Sunday.
10 till 12, part-timer. We look forward to that. Have you been up all night? What do you do on a personal level on nights like
well,
this?
As you know, James, it's sort of very sad. This is my Christmas, things like this. But the thing is that now we've increasingly moved to these sort of almost 3-day extravaganzas with these things. Whereas, once upon a time, listeners will remember nearly all of the counts were done overnight. you kind of have to pace yourself a bit. So I actually, against all my instincts and reflexes, went to bed, although I'm feeling quite glad of it this morning.
Yes, no, fair enough.
I didn't stay up for Redditch, but I regret it.
I didn't stay up for Redditch. That could be your next memoir, couldn't it?
Next!
No, sorry, that could be your memoir. I meant your next book when you finish the one that you're currently working on.
Not far from me. Yeah.
I didn't stay up for Redditch by Lewis Goodall.
Alas, should have done.
Give us what you think of the headlines, or even perhaps the interesting things that aren't going to make the headlines.
Well, look, I think we should say, first of all, and it just connected to what I've just said, because we've moved to these 3-day or 2 to 3 day local election kind of long weekends, if you like, the worst kind of long weekend for many people. It is true. Something that I think people have not borne in mind adequately in the last few cycles is you rush to the instant judgments on the Friday morning or the early Friday afternoon. And actually the narrative can change quite quickly. I remember the year before last, it looked like it had been a sort of terrible result for Labour, pretty good for the Conservatives on the Friday morning, but when the different mayoralties started to come in and so on, you actually saw a much more varied picture. So we shouldn't rush to judgment. What I would say is what we shouldn't rush away from, because we're going to get 2,000 more council seats come in over the course of the next 24 to 36 hours, the mayoralties this afternoon and tomorrow, we shouldn't lose sight, I would just say, of Blackpool South. Blackpool South is going to be, and seats like it, far more important than anything that actually happens with, say, the big mayoralties, which will get all of the attention.
Because that was the story of 2019.
That was the story of 2019. It was winning seats like Blackpool South, which had largely been, sort of absolute marginal seats. And the point is what that brought the Conservatives their big majority. But more importantly as well, I think you have to see it in the context, the piece, which is, I think we lose sight of this. We've had a lot of by-elections in the course of this Parliament, partly as a result of the recall provision that we now have. Yes. That means we have more opportunities to test the kind of political weather as the Parliament has progressed. And if you just take the long view from 2021, basically the story of parliamentary politics, in terms of by-elections at least, from 2021-22 onwards, is crushing defeat after defeat for the Conservatives. Initially to the Lib Dems in the south of England. You think of seats like, North Shropshire and Honiton and Cheshire and Amersham and so on. But pretty much from the back end of 2022 onwards to Labour. You think of Selby and Ainsty, Conservative to Labour, swing 23%, Mid-Beds 20%, Tamworth 24%, Wellingborough 28.5%. And now Blackpool South 26%. We've kind of got used to this.
These are massive. I hadn't thought of it in conjunction in the main, in the whole.
Indeed, we've got used to this, but I mean, if you look just Blackpool South, as I say, third biggest swing to Labour in parliamentary history at a by-election, and the Conservatives only just defeated Reform by 100 votes. So for my money, you can always point to a particular by-election and say there are particular kind of exigencies and things about that place and whatever, but if you put them all together, what you've seen is a long trend of really profound defeat for the Conservatives, and there is no sign of that trend abating or lessening, which really, Rishi Sunak is fond of saying this is midterm problems. This is midterm if you think like the end of November is the middle of the year. It's not. This is getting towards the absolute sort of fag end, bottom of the year and of the parliamentary term. And if there's no sign of kind of resurrection or vivification for the Conservatives, then you've got to ask, number 10, what is the plan to get themselves out of it that has been different up to now?
And what would they say?
I think they would try and say, they would point to the last couple of weeks, and whatever you think about the particular politics of it, they would point to Rwanda, they would point to getting on the front foot on things like benefits and so on. And again, just leave aside one's own personal views about those things. People listening might not like that. But these are things they think they can get to the front foot on politically. And they think that if they can just get through this danger period now for Rishi Sunak, which is going to be dangerous, perilous in parliamentary terms, in terms of the leadership of his party over the next 48 hours or so, they think if they can get through it, they can point to victories, as we're expecting in the Tees Valley, imminently for Ben Houchin. I've been talking to Birmingham Labour sources this morning who are very pessimistic about Labour's chances in the West Midlands with Andy Street, partly because of the Gaza issue and the Muslim vote in Birmingham in particular being suppressed for Labour. Maybe they can point to, I know there's been a lot of rather fetid speculation about Susan Hall over the past 24 hours, but if they can point to it, maybe a narrower than expected defeat in London for Susan Hall. I was speaking to a London Conservative sort this morning who said that they would be amazed if she won. They were saying that...
Just as a fan of mischief.
For our purposes, James.
I was going to say cynically, for business.
For business, it certainly might not be the worst outcome, but certainly in terms of... It would be, it would be an astonishing upset.
If it
would
were to
dominate.
happen, the only path through which it could be delivered would be if turnout in central London went off a cliff,
Yes.
and partly perhaps the suppression of a Muslim vote would
Yes.
be there, despite Sadiq
Yes,
Khan's
if
own-
that's happening in Birmingham, there's no reason it wouldn't happen in London, although perhaps
and high turnout in outer London.
And high turnout, basically the Boris Johnson strategy plus. And the fact, I mean, this is a conservative source, London source saying this morning. They were saying, which is true, that Sadiq Khan, I think most impartial political analysts would reckon with, he's got his problems as a candidate. For a start, he's running for a third term.
Yeah.
That's never happened
And he
before.
seemed to
Ken
be just
Livingstone
running
lost.
on I'm not Susan Hall.
Boris Johnson would probably have lost if he'd tried it in 2016. So, it is a difficult start to begin with, albeit with obviously the Labour Party nationally polling extremely well. There has been ULEZ. So there are people who would say that he had deep frailties as incumbent. And indeed, I think if Susan Hall does lose more narrowly than expected, there will be, as this Conservative was saying to me, there will be a real inquest within the London Conservative Party, and which ultimately, to some extent, comes down to Sunak's door as the party leader, about the selection. If Paul Scully, for example, who had previously been Minister for London, widely respected MP, had run, we might be having a different conversation today, if indeed it turns out it is a bit narrower than people expect.
Although, and I know you know this, it is a little anomalous, because Sadiq Khan is less popular than the party at the moment. And these mayoralties, in fact, almost all of these mayoralties, I suppose Boris Johnson was the apotheosis of this, have been often seemed to be more about candidate than party.
Indeed so. And we are seeing, I mean, look, it's likely that virtually all of the incumbent mayors, we get to the end of today and tomorrow, that all of the incumbent mayors are re-elected. And that says something about, I think, the kind of nature of those political offices, that, you get these people, as long as they're not completely incompetent or useless, they become deeply associated with those places in the media. Voters see them fighting for their area. They become Mr. Teesside, Mr. Birmingham,
that's exactly
Mr. Manchester, and whatever it is. And maybe, again, it speaks to Khan's frailties as a candidate. Maybe you could argue, if you're putting it more positively, that he was brave about ULEZ and so on, that he knew it was an unpopular policy. He stuck his colours to it, and it suppressed his vote, particularly in the outer boroughs, that he would be a bit anomalous by comparison.
Yeah, no, so, I mean, still quite a lot to watch, and that result doesn't appear until tomorrow, so you'll be getting stuck right into it.
On Sunday, we'll have all the results, the full canopy.
What else can we look forward to?
Well, it's all a surprise, we don't want to say, James, and that's not as a means of masking the fact that it's still a fluid picture, of course.
Build up a bit of tension.
Build up a bit of tension.
It's the ultimate hook and
X factor me, James.
I enjoyed your point there about the mayors, because I don't know why. I think it's because I grew up in Kidderminster, not far from, of course, where you grew up. So, but
you had Richard Taylor as Mr. Kidderminster.
We did, that's right, from the NHS party. He was a lovely man. But you very rarely heard Kidderminster in the news, and particularly having moved to London. So what the mayor does, it's almost like the political equivalent of when you hear your hometown in a national news bulletin. They become the embodiment of localness. They become the
or maybe your local football team in a sort of bigger fixture
on an FA Cup run or something like that. I've never thought of it like that.
I think
that's a brilliant way of descringing
it. Well, James, thank you so much. That's why I love coming on
your show. You should have your own show on Sunday mornings called, I don't know,
Friday with Lewis Goodall. Something like that.
But so that's why it defies both party popularity and traditional analysis.
Also, and if you were to put it, maybe if you're a bit more cynically as well, right now the truth as well is that the mayoralties, particularly outside London, don't have that much power. So they have a lot of they have authority, but they don't have much formal power. And so maybe as well as a slight element of them not. Voters being aware, they're not getting the kicking when they sort of see something goes wrong. They're not necessarily receiving the kind of the negative, the opprobrium that they might get if they were actually responsible for more stuff, which you could say maybe Khan, who does have more power, maybe that office is a slightly more traditional kind of political office, whereas right now these other ones are a little bit more kind of banging the drum symbolism.
If we were on television, I would have been stroking my chin at various points during that exchange.
That's all I aim for.
I may even have, if you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe, ring that bell. Hey, what is that?
I can confirm he's now rubbing his chin.
I am now rubbing my chin. Yeah. Particularly on that mayoral business, and that's why you should tune in on Sunday morning for these sort of insights. And Simon says, get a room, you two.
We've got one. We're in a room.
We're in
a sealed room.
It's exactly that. Lewis Goodall, many thanks indeed. The time is approaching 12 noon. You are listening to Fridays with James O'Brien on LBC. Time now for, well, you know what it's time for now. Good grief, the third hour. It is 3 minutes after 12 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we don't allow ourselves much time with our crystal balls, do we? We're too busy dealing with what's unfolding in front of us and what's happened behind us than to have a proper, long, hard look at what's likely or possibly going to transpire ahead of us. But I have been drawn this morning to the question of existential threat to the Conservative Party, and indeed to at least one caller's analysis of the need for a profound change in order to survive, whether it's some form of electoral reform, which is unlikely, given that electoral reform in this country would involve the party that has just won via a first-past-the-post system legislating to abandon the first-past-the-post system. The only time in which we've seen it become reality, never mind mere likelihood, was when the Conservatives needed the support of the Liberal Democrats to form a government. And one of the requirements of that coalition agreement was, of course, a ballot on a form of electoral reform. I can't quite see that happening again, absent another coalition at some point, and the Liberal Democrats having another chance to get something over the line. So I don't know that that's going to happen. But when Tom talked about a split in there are now two Conservative parties. See, with Corbyn's Labour, there were never two Labour parties in Parliament. There were two Labour parties in the country, but there were never two Labour parties in Parliament. I don't know why. Well, I do know why. It's because Corbyn represented a kind of tradition of dissent within his own party. And there's no way that anyone could describe Rishi Sunak as that, you know, the ideological purity lot on the left who are spending all of their time trying to root out people from their own organisation for not being ideologically pure enough. In a way, they were Corbyn's people, and there's none of them in Parliament because Parliament is a place where pragmatism is prized. Or self-interest, of course, is prized. It depends how you look at it. It could be one man's pragmatism is another man's ambition. So the Tory party in its current form does not stand comparison with the mess that the Labour Party found itself in just before Keir Starmer took over. And not to minimise Keir Starmer's achievement, that's why he was able to reunite it, to recalibrate it as a sensible-looking, electable operation, which it wasn't by 2019 under anybody's measure. So the Tory party is, and I did an A-level in politics in 1990. I mentioned that solely to establish the span of time over which I have some vague qualification to comment. The Tory party, I'm going to suggest to you, and I wouldn't have done this at 10 o'clock, but having listened to the calls that we've taken today, the Tory party is in, I would say, graver danger than at any point in my life. In fact, I'd go further, given that I was born in 1972. I'd probably say the Tory party is in a graver danger than at any point in its own life. Do you agree? And obviously your agreement becomes much more interesting, forgive me, if you are a Tory member in the Tory party or a seasoned traditional Tory supporter. I'll say that again because it's a bit hypocritical for someone who 10 minutes ago was boasting about not being a fan of hyperbole. But this is not hyperbole. This is sincere from me. The more I've thought about it this morning, the more I've... And regardless of what happens in the general election, I mean, almost up to and including a narrow win for the Tories. I grant you it sounds a bit odd to say that they could win very, very narrowly and still be under existential threat. But you know, we talked about Tito in the former Yugoslavia earlier this week, and the idea, oddly, it was in the context of Nicola Sturgeon and Humza Yousaf's inability to hold the party together, really, or certainly inability to hold the coalition together. But the idea of a leader whose personal attributes are so great that they can somehow defy reality, they can hold together all manner of disparate ingredients, as Tito did for the former Yugoslavia. I grant you that's probably a simplistic analysis, but absent that, if you can't think of a Tory who could somehow, and Johnson tried, and Johnson could try again, and some people would want Johnson to try again, but if Johnson tried again, even if he succeeded, it would all fall apart again because of Johnson's moral depravity and his inability to be serious or tell the truth, or for most of his life, keep his trousers on. So the idea of a figure so charismatic and effective that they could not only plaster over all of the cracks in the Tory party machine, but also somehow turn it into an outwardly cohesive phenomenon, I just can't see it. So get your duster, get your chamois leather, get your crystal ball out, give it a little polish with your chamois, have a look into it, tell me, what does the future look like for the Conservative Party? And you go to the front of the queue, at least in the first instance, if you can tell me what the future looks like for your Conservative Party. For your Conservative Party. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. A couple more calls on questions that I've already asked, which of course are queuing up. We'll take those in a moment. But first I thought, shall we have a little listen to Rishi Sunak speaking a few moments ago at a military base in Yorkshire?
Do you need to convince your party you can do better in a general election?
Well, as I said, if Keir Starmer was in Harlow on Wednesday saying that was a place that he needed to win in order to win the next general election, that hasn't happened. We still haven't got the results from places like Tees Valley with the mayoralty results, which again is a key battleground. I'm focused completely on the job at hand. That's delivering for people across the country. If you just look at what we're doing in the last week or so alone, a £900 tax cut hitting people's payslips, the first failed asylum seeker off to Rwanda. At the same time, what have Labour said? Well, they said that they are going to scrap the Rwanda scheme and, as far as I can tell, offer an amnesty to illegal migrants. That's no way to solve that problem, which is important to people right up and down the country.
That is really bad, man. In fact, crikey. Do you know, as that played out, the political editor of HuffPost, Kevin Schofield, who's a very astute observer of politics, he tweeted, judging by the level of denial, this was much earlier today, but it just popped up on my feed, judging by the level of denial from senior Tories this morning, the looming Labour general election victory is going to come as a massive shock to them. Do you know, I'm actually going to play you that again because I'm surprised at how rattled he sounds. And it wasn't a particularly difficult question. In fact, going back to what Emily Craigie was alluding to when she talked about having asked Ben Houchen the question about his political future about 1 million times. This is a question that Rishi Sunak woke up this morning knowing he was going to be asked several times. And this is the best he could do?
Do you need to convince your party you can do better in a general election?
Well, as I said, if Keir Starmer was in Harlow on Wednesday saying that was a place that he needed to win in order to win the next general election, that hasn't happened. We still haven't got the results from places like Tees Valley with the mayoralty results, which again is a key battleground. I'm focused completely on the job at hand. That's delivering for people across the country. If you just look at what we're doing in the last week or so alone, a £900 tax cut hitting people's payslips, the first failed asylum seeker off to Rwanda. At the same time, what have Labour said? Well, they said that they are going to scrap the Rwanda scheme and, as far as I can tell, offer an amnesty to illegal migrants. That's no way to solve that problem, which is important to people right up and down the country.
So do you need to work harder to convince your own party that you can lead them into a general election? Something, Harlow something, Rwanda something, Starmer something, amnesty something, Blair. Not Blair, Blur. Well, not Blur. But, oh, heck, how do you pronounce it? If it's spelled Bleurgh, how do you pronounce it? Blair. Yeah, thank you. Blair. So, anyway, amnesty, something, Blair. Not Blair and not Blur. Although I believe Dave Rowntree of Blur is running as an MP in the party that was once led by Blair. So, I don't know where I'm going with this, but I feel that I'm running out of road. Shall I take a call? Paul's in Weybridge. Paul, Blair or Blur?
Oh, Blur.
Carry on.
Blur.
What made you pick up the phone today?
The Labour Party, the point you made about since 1990, you'd never seen the Conservative Party in such a bad
Since 1922, state. Mate.
Yeah.
Not that I was around.
This time, if the Labour Party play go and sort immigration, the Conservatives are done.
Partly because that's all the Conservatives have got left. And
that's all they've got. You bring everybody that they've got that you put forward, name them, and they're all talking about them based on the back of immigration. That's all they've got. Johnson, even off the back of immigration, because without immigration, you would have had Brexit.
No, you're right.
Yeah. We're an island mentality. We've got island mentality. You say immigration, we think invasion.
Yeah. Well, I
Yeah?
don't, and I don't know whether you do
but
or
I
not.
mean, but the Tory right, from the point of view is if you take their trump card away from them, they've got nothing. They've been in for 14 years and they've got nothing to show for it. So every time he's talking Rwanda, right? Just before a general election, and he's had to pay someone $3,000 to get on a plane.
He has.
I mean, what? That's just ridiculous.
Well,
All
here's
they've
the
got
thing.
is immigration.
I think, I can agree with you and disagree with you at the same time, because I would like them to detoxify the immigration issue. I would like to have transparency and honesty. And I can tell you for a fact that inside Downing Street, they know that we need quite a lot of immigration in this country and will do for generations to come. But outside Downing Street, they keep promising to reduce it. So I'm not sure that actually reducing it might solve a political problem, but it would
You don't
create...
have to reduce it, do you? You have
Well, what
to get
does
hold of
fixing it mean then?
Well, it means having a system that stops the Conservatives making immigration so toxic.
But they will always make it toxic, because you'll stop the boats or whatever and bring back proper asylum processes, which means we will have an increase in the number of people securing asylum here, as is right and proper. But the Tories will have now moved so far in the direction of Suella Braverman that they will say there is a genuine refugee fleeing persecution and war, and the Labour Party have let him move to Birmingham. And that they'll just revivify the toxicity and the unpleasantness, because you got close to it when you talked about an island mentality. What it really is xenophobia. And it doesn't matter what they do with immigration. This is why it's fallen apart as a topic for the Tories in the last couple of years. They've had 14 years to deliver the whether you want to call it the nasty party stuff or the robust restrictions on it or the control our borders rhetoric. They've had 14 years to deliver it, and they can't.
Yeah, but the Labour Party needs to be careful that it doesn't fall into the trap that they end up spinning the Tory line on immigration.
I think they are falling into that trap.
They definitely are.
Yeah.
Because when they sit there and they go, well, have you got a plan? Have you got a plan? What you're basically doing, what the Labour Party should do is go, right, let's get our best minds. We're not at war, but let's have an immigration cabinet.
Completely transparent about it. The problem with this is that it puts immigration in crisis territory. It's a crisis. It's a massive problem that must be solved. And that is... A, not necessarily true in terms of statistics and evidence, and B, it's a Farage narrative. But
who feeds off it, James?
Well,
right?
I know, but I want to take it off.
But they wouldn't be there.
Well, yeah.
Yes. Well, you wouldn't. You have to, whether people like it or not.
No, but they would be there. They would be there, because whatever you did, you would still have Farage Mark II complaining about there being... Because ultimately, you and I can have a sensible conversation about immigration and what's needed in the relationship between demographics and economics and resident population and incoming population. But there will always be somebody, whether it's Nick Griffin or Nigel Farage or somebody else, there'll always be somebody who goes, oh, foreigners, ugh. And when the Tories are looking electorally fragile, they will be the ones hemorrhaging support to the people going, ugh, foreigners, ugh. And they will change their plans accordingly. Labour can do nothing to remove the foreigners element from UK politics, ever. Nobody can. They'll always be there. There'll always be somebody there shouting about how, I don't need to remind you of what it said on posters in Birmingham in the 1970s.
Exactly.
They'll always be there, Paul, those people. So my position is, I think, the opposite of yours, which is the Tories are killing themselves by refusing to look anywhere else. All they're doing is looking further to the right. And Labour, if they were to actually... We're heading for the same target from completely different places or using completely different tactics, because Labour would successfully detoxify it and leave the people going, foreigners, looking isolated and stupid for a while. Because then when you have a refugee crisis or an economic crisis... I'm afraid that sort of xenophobia and othering would move straight back into the centre.
Yeah, but I don't think that this country has a major problem with immigration.
No, but you began by saying that's the thing. If Labour can I think the phone line's gone south. If Labour can get a proper handle on that, then they'll be golden for generations to come. Again, brilliant call, really thought provoking, and thank you. It is 12:18. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Not like me to miss this. Thanks to Chris Rankin for picking up on it. Good luck detoxifying immigration while the Daily Mail, etc., are still in print. I mean, I liked Paul's analysis. I liked its optimism as well. But yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think the first phrase I came up with as a radio presenter that had legs was probably the phrase about the ease with which you can sell tickets for the ghost train as opposed to the speed your weight machine. Don't groan. I used to say it a hell of a lot more than I do now. But that's the problem, you see, that the commercial imperative, really, of frightening and angering people. Look at how rich, if you think I'm exaggerating, look how rich Rupert Murdoch is. Right? So the commercial good sense, the profitability, there you go, that's the word I'm looking for, the profitability of peddling prejudice, whether it's Fox News or the Daily Mail or the Daily Telegraph or the Daily Express or whatever it may be, the profitability of peddling prejudice will always poison politics. Always. Because the people who have been sold, the people to whom the prejudice has been peddled, have votes. And the people who want those votes will have to appeal to the prejudices that have been peddled by the media. Look, it's not this simple, and it's probably more circular and chicken and egg than that. But the impossibility of detoxifying immigration, which was the dream I described to Paul in Weybridge, is rendered impossible by the fact that the Daily Mail and Rupert Murdoch will still be there, and there'll still be people popping up, and there'll still be billionaires setting up television stations so that racists can have an even bigger platform than they've got already, because, albeit that these television stations currently hemorrhage money quicker than the Tories are hemorrhaging votes, the idea is that either the influence that they accrue by owning such organs, such outlets, is valuable enough to justify the financial loss because they will make more money elsewhere as a consequence of having that influence, or the appeal to the vanity of people that have made a ton of money elsewhere. I think that's really important. I can't believe I missed it, Chris. It's normally one of my hardy perennials, isn't it? The role that the right-wing media plays in all of this. But yeah, that's the problem, I think. That you could have all the political will in the world to either fix or detoxify immigration as an issue, but as long as you've got people both in politics, like Nigel Farage or Nick Griffin, and or in media, like, as I've said, Rupert Murdoch or Paul Dacre or various columnists on The Sun and The Mail and elsewhere, as long as they watch their income increase according to the amount of xenophobia or jingoism or racism that they peddle, the political project to detoxify immigration is probably doomed. Oh, that's sad. I've never quite worked it through that far before, but there it is. And thank you to Paul for setting my thoughts off in that direction. Tony's in Abergavenny. Tony, what would you like to say?
Oh, hello, mate.
Hello, Tony. Did I wake you up? Did I wake you up? Did I wake you up,
Yeah.
Tony? Sorry, pal.
Yeah.
Sorry. If a man can't have a snooze when he's on hold to LBC, then when can he? When can he? Go on.
What a golden programme you got today.
It's nice, isn't it?
Yeah, it's all downhill now, mate.
Go on with it.
I'll try and, I was going to say, try and make it relevant. About the Tory party, which I'm not a supporter of at all.
Okay.
I think the only way that they can actually, people want them to come back, the sort of traditional Tory, is if they had somebody like Neil Kinnock who came in and exercised them like he did Militant that time. And I don't think they've got anybody of that ilk or is brave enough who is independent enough to do it. I think there's
a Kinnock. Starmer. Yeah, but Kinnock's easier, isn't it? Less controversial. He didn't get elected, of course, but I think everybody accepts he set the scene for what followed.
Exactly, and he got rid of Militant and booted him out, and that could have cost him dear. I mean, I remember the meeting when all the
really
Hutton,
good point. Yeah,
they all got up and walk out. Eric Heffer, my mum used to know him actually, but they all walked out, and he said, "You'll bloody listen."
Yeah,
I remember that. I nearly cried because he's such a good bloke.
We're not bending. In fact, you remind me, I've made a bit of a fool of myself with some of the more hyperbolic. No, well, I have, haven't I? Because the Labour Party has been in a similar existential state, and talking about how can a party contain Suella Braverman and the latter-day Rory Stewart. But in fact, the Labour Party was a party that could contain Tony Benn and Dennis Healey, or it could contain Dennis Skinner and Gordon Brown. So you can have a party of disparate parts.
And people go along, talk about Corbyn, but Corbyn was 30 years he was in the party, and not one private member's bill, not one magic speech. He was no Michael Foot. He was no. He was more interested in he just wasn't part of the mainstream at all. He was a protest merchant.
Yes, he was, and John Landsman saw correctly that he could be moulded into a wonderful maypole for disaffected voters, old and largely young. So,
but bringing this to the Tory party,
are they finished?
I don't. I think what was interesting. I was looking at Femi on his YouTube, and he brings up a thing about the Telegraph lady who was not wanting to be fascist, and he introduced. It's a poster that's on sale with the National Holocaust Museum.
Yeah,
and it's got a poster there, and it's got warning signs of fashion.
Fascism.
Yeah, and they got. About eight of those things.
He's nicking my act. He's nicking my act, that lad. I was doing this before Brexit.
Yeah, but he's good, isn't he?
He is good, yeah.
So you.
So go on, give me a couple of things on that you think we could already tick off now.
Right. Identification of enemies, scapegoats as a unifying cause.
Yeah.
Disdain for human rights.
Yeah. That's a policy now.
Yeah, controlled mass media. There you go.
Yeah,
BBC. I've read your book.
I don't think we've got that yet, but
not
hey ho,
quite.
the night is young.
Look at the Mail, all those sort of things.
True.
What was I saying? Disdain for intellectuals and the arts.
Well, that's happening now. That's happening in front of us, and of course, with that comes a complete dismissal of observable history. Real history gets turned into, lies and politics, which brings us back to Kemi Badenoch jumping on a Tufton Street bandwagon designed to persuade people that slavery didn't make that much of a difference to our economic health over the last few hundred years at all, because, of course, that's the only way that you can keep certain unpleasant fires burning and head off any conversations about reparations or restorative justice. Tony, thank you. 28 minutes after 12 is the time. Let's go from Wales to Scotland. Charlie's in Edinburgh. Charlie, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hi there. Interesting discussion today. I was a Tory voter for many years, and I'm in a situation now where I struggle to find a home, so I feel disenfranchised. But in terms of what does the Tory party do now? Well, we all know there's effectively a battle going on behind the scenes for the soul of the Conservative Party between the sort of likes of Suella Braverman and that ilk to the more sort of kind of less extreme middle of the road. I think they call themselves One Nation Tories or whatever it is. And it's a really interesting one to see what's going to happen. Are they going to lurch further and further to the right and listening to the likes of Miss Truss talking about the deep state? And I do struggle sometimes to really think that do these people really think that the majority of us and relatively sensible people in the UK hopefully are going to listen to that and think, really?
I do that as well. I'm fascinated by that. I spend more time than I should thinking about that. Because you sort of, who does Liz Truss think? There is a theory that she's simply just sort of getting in with the mad American evangelical Christian, very right-wing people who lost touch with reality decades ago. But a bit like
Nadine Dorries, you mean, as well?
Yeah, except I don't think that there's as much conscious understanding of anything with Nadine Dorries. I think she's a bit like, when you're in the shower, Charlie, and the shower head, if you're lucky, the water pressure is so great that the shower head works its way loose from its bracket and you're trying to pick up the shower head and it's just spraying everywhere, and there's absolutely I think that's Nadine Dorries. I think Truss is a different kind of challenging. But yeah, who? I mean, she said, I was researching my book, I had to double check that she actually said this. So she blamed her, or the fiscal event, as John Curtice called it earlier. That saw.
But can I just?
Hang on, let me finish the plug first.
I'm currently reading it.
Oh, Carol, you plug. Oh, that's fine then. Thank you very much. But she did actually say that her government had been undermined by, I think it was Green campaigners and trans activists.
Yes, I struggle to understand how. Do they really think that peddling this type of... But then again, I suppose there may be people out there that would swallow that. I just don't know.
Yes, but who are they? That's the question that we're circling around. And of course, how many of them are there? Because this seems to be at the heart of the delusion, the idea that there's loads of them. And if you were surrounded only by people who were buying this stuff, swallowing this stuff, you know, and they were your mates in the think tanks and on the Daily Telegraph and... You know, you'd got your chief of staff from the Taxpayers Alliance, and literally that's all they ever hear from each other while screaming about how the rest of us inhabit a echo chamber. Charlie, great stuff. Thank you for that. On all counts, 12:32 is the time. Some breaking news for you, as expected. Ben Houchen has won Tees Valley as mayor, so he remains in place as mayor of the Tees Valley. After the headlines, we'll be joined by Darren Jones, the shadow chief secretary to the Treasury, for his responses to events overnight. And we haven't seen Natasha yet. Can we wake Natasha up? Is she all right? We must get Natasha Clark in the studio as well for her expert insights too. Before all of that, Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines. 12:35 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. That result confirmed. Ben Houchen, or Lord Ben Houchen, to the likes of you, returned as mayor of the Tees Valley. Keeps him in the job he's held since 2017, I think, and gives Rishi Sunak a rare glimmer of good news. Darren Jones is the shadow chief secretary to the Treasury, Labour MP for Bristol West. How big is that glimmer, Darren?
Well, I think for Rishi Sunak, I suspect he will want it to be as big a glimmer as possible. The fact, though, as you and your listeners know, is that Labour never expected to win Teesside because vote share was so huge last time. I think the really important analysis is now going to be how those votes were spread across the key parliamentary constituencies in that region in respect of the general election, where we feel much more confident.
And we should probably add that he secured 72.8% of the vote in 2021 and 53.6% of the vote overnight. So, good news is a multifaceted concept. What are you most pleased with for Labour overnight?
I think it looks like we have won the trust of many voters across the country whom we lost in 2019 and in previous elections. And we appear to be performing strongly in the constituencies that provide the route to Downing Street for the general election later this year. We've clearly still got more work to do. We're not complacent about that in any way, and we'll continue to work hard in every part of the country as we wait for the Prime Minister to call the general election. But overall, a good night for Labour and a good, strong direction of travel as we head to that general election.
And what were you most disappointed by?
Well, of course, we never like to lose any elections. It's a team sport, isn't it, politics? You want to win everything. And so where you've got candidates who have worked really hard alongside their volunteers and the campaign staff, you feel for them not getting across the line. We've all been there every now and again in our time in politics. And as I say, clearly there's more work to be done in different parts of the country with different types of votes.
You've answered both questions without any specifics whatsoever. And people are telling me that you're one of the good guys. You're one of the impressive, straight-talking members of the Labour. But what are you most pleased with? Oh, well, obviously all the good stuff. And what are you most unhappy about? Well, obviously all the bad stuff. Come on, Darren.
Is that a surprising answer? I like the good things. I don't like the bad things.
Well, I was looking for perhaps some names, some faces, some places, some actual specific detail.
Oh, I think you might need, Professor Curtice and others.
We've already had him.
Insight.
Okay. I don't suppose there was any early word on what might happen in London, what might happen to that mayoralty?
No, I have no particular insight at this stage. Obviously, it's a first-past-the-post election now, not a proportional voting system, and the votes are being counted, and we'll have to wait to see the outcome when it's declared.
Well, while I have you, why do you think that the mayoral votes are so detached sometimes from the party's general fortunes, regardless of whether you're a Labour mayor or a Tory mayor? What is it about mayoralties that somehow insulate them from the ebb and flow of national party politics?
I think there are a couple of things. I mean, there are lots of examples of politicians, whether you're a councillor or an MP or a mayor, where if you've got a particular kind of respect locally, or to use a kind of commercial phrase, brand recognition, you might pick up more votes than your party's national position. We see that all the time in different parties in different places across the country. I think another problem with some of the mayoral systems is that there's not really effective scrutiny between elections. There's no accountability checks really for regional mayors, whether they're Labour or Conservative, quite frankly. And so maybe voters don't get the day-to-day analysis or questions that are put to ministers in Westminster in the same way that you do in regional elections. But it's clear that for Ben Houchen and for other Conservative mayors, they've decided at this election they need to campaign broadly as independent candidates. I think it was hard to find Conservative branding or the word Conservative on any of their literature or their campaign materials. And look, if I was in their position, I would do exactly the same thing. They've lent into their local independence as much as they can, away from Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives' national brand. And look, that's helped them locally. Whether it will help the Conservatives nationally in a general election, we don't think so, but time will tell.
I hear you. Here's something you could have said when I asked you what you were most disappointed with. You've lost overall control of Oldham Council. You've also seen the loss of a significant number of councillors in Bolton, almost certainly because of a loss of support among traditional Labour voters from the Muslim community. And this is in response to what they perceive to be an inadequate or even an immoral stance on the Israel-Gaza situation. You must be a bit worried about that.
Well, yeah, and look, we're very sad about that. There's no denying that in some parts of the country where some independent candidates have run for the first time, they've attracted voters that we would want in the Labour family.
On this very specific issue.
On this issue. And that shows that we've got more work to do to listen to and learn from and support voters across the country and try to persuade them to vote for Labour when they get the chance to at the ballot box.
So what would that look like in policy terms?
Well, I think the national policy is dictated by global affairs. There's only so much that we can do, both as a United Kingdom and especially as an opposition party in respect of events in other parts of the world. But I think we need to make the case, one, about our compassion on the issues that are being affected, two, our ability to listen to people who deeply care about these issues, but three, to make the broader case about how a Labour government can change the country in their broader interests.
Well, they're not really interested in that. I speak to these people most weeks, and they are motivated by a passionate concern for the Palestinian people, to the point yesterday of a young man in Boreham Wood who was thinking of not just deserting the Labour Party, Darren Jones, but emigrating, because he feels that your party has less concern about children that look like his children than they do about children that look like yours or mine.
Well, look, it's not for me to say whether his view is right or wrong. That's how he feels about the situation, and I'm sorry about that. That is not the Labour Party view, I can tell you.
But it's a very specific response to a failure to support, for example, an arms embargo.
Of course, and on the arms export licence position, we've asked questions, we've raised issues with ministers to try to understand the legal position and what's happening on the licences, and ministers have not published the information in order for us to be able to pursue that effectively. But look, you're right, for voters that feel that way, we've got more work to do. We're very conscious of that as the Labour Party, and we're going to continue to make that case and to try to work with them and try to get their support as we approach a general election later this year.
Hand on heart, when will the general election be?
Don't know.
I should have predicted that.
It's Rishi Sunak's decision, right? And I don't think he really knows yet. All we know is that Rishi Sunak would like it to be later in the year. The question is whether the Conservative Party can hold together that long. All we know in the Labour Party is that we want it as soon as possible. We're ready to go as soon as it's called, and we encourage him to do so.
Darren Jones, Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury and Labour MP for Bristol North West. Thank you for your time today. The time is approaching 12:44. Squeeze in a quick call, and after the next hiatus, catch up with Natasha Clark, who has been up, I think, literally all night. James is in St Helens on the future of the Tory party. James, what would you like to say?
Thanks, James. First time call. I've been listening for a while. It's good to speak to you.
Thank you, mate.
I think what the right are going to end up with in the next few years, if we get a Labour government, which I'm expecting we will, is that you can't win when there's two parties fighting for the same votes. I think what the left has realised over Brexit and in 2019, you can't have the Greens, Labour, Lib Dems all fighting for the same votes. I think that's why you've seen Labour winning in places where the Green votes collapsed, the Lib Dem votes collapsed, and what's going to happen on the right is people can say, I voted for reform, and they've not won. And the Conservatives can't win either. So there's going to be some sort of tug of war between the two.
Yes, I think there is, but they're never going to make electoral impact reform except in undermining Conservative positions, even if by some miracle they get someone elected as an MP. The major consequence of their presence in any race would be, as you've just pointed out, hemorrhaging Tory support. But if Tories got into bed with reform in order to shut off that hemorrhage, then there's loads of people and there's still a fair number of people there who'd be repulsed. There's still a lot of traditional Tory voters who would find that repulsive. Not as many as they used to be because they've already been repulsed. But that's the problem, isn't it? That's the fundamental problem.
Yeah, you can't win.
You can't win
all the way on one side. You've got to win the centre in some way, and that's, I guess, while they're in
win the centre while you're deporting refugees and demonising disabled people. I don't think.
No, and it depends. I guess the people who are voting for reform or saying they will vote for reform at the moment think that that's more important than any of the other issues that the Conservative Party might be able to achieve for them in power.
That's beautifully put. And who are those people and how many of them are there? Which is a question we asked a moment ago about the people Liz Truss is appealing to when she claims that her own administration was somehow undone by eco-zealots and trans activists. I think she added in the civil service. A few of you have had a go at working out who these people are. John in Reading says, who would listen and believe that stuff, James? The biggest voting bloc of all, the elderly, the grey vote. Well, come on, mate. Maybe some of them. But Jim says, surrounded by these people who swallow this stuff, James, welcome to Fareham, which is probably also a little bit unfair on the majority of people in Fareham. But I read I say what I see. And the biggest problem for the Tory party, points out Alan, is that they believe that the bot farms are real people. It's chicken and egg, that, because I increasingly find myself persuaded that some of the bot farms are actually funded by rather more mainstream political movements or quotes, think tanks, end quotes, than you may allow, although that makes me come closer to being a conspiracy theorist than I like. But yeah, they do seem to think that the replies to Suella Braverman's tweets are somehow representative of the broader population because they keep trying to pander to the kind of people who reply ecstatically to Suella Braverman's tweets. And in conclusion, Stephen, no, I'm not putting you in idiot's corner because you're clearly a very nice man and very polite. You say, good afternoon, Mr. O'Brien. Michelle Obama once said, when they go low, we go high. Labour should heed her advice. Stephen, when Michelle Obama made that point, she was speaking in support of Hillary Clinton, who subsequently lost to Donald Trump, of all people. So sage and warming advice though it may be, it is not necessarily electorally pragmatic. It's 12:47. It's 10-1. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Natasha Clark, LBC's political editor, is here to answer questions that you've probably already answered 10 times in the last 12 hours, but not to me.
Not to you.
How threatened is Rishi Sunak? How weakened is his position?
Look, it's obviously not a good night for him at all, but I still don't think that he's facing an imminent leadership challenge. Now, a multitude of reasons for that, but we're starting to see what they're going to be able to point to now, which is, look, it is possible for us to try and hold on to some of these seats, like the Ben Houchen result that's just come into Tees Valley. And look, they are obviously going to be clutching at straws in some of these areas, and we've had Tories this morning pointing to places like Harlow, which Keir Starmer wanted to win and didn't win, places like Broxbourne as well. But there have been very few areas that the Conservatives can point to say, look, we're holding on, holding our vote. They've lost more than half, I think, now of the seats that they were contesting. But they will be able to have hope. And I think a lot of Conservatives will look at places like Ben Houchen and potentially Andy Street in the West Midlands and go, if I distance myself enough from the Conservative brand, I might be able to hold on to my seat.
Very different for a mayor than an MP.
Of course it is, and but it's not a bad strategy. It's worked
for them. Yeah. And to that point, whether or not it fell off or something in the green room, Ben Houchen appearing on stage to hear the news of his victory was the only one of the three candidates not wearing a rosette emblazoned with the colours and logo of his own party. I know you're not a betting woman, but I mean, put it in percentage terms. The likelihood of Rishi Sunak leading the Conservatives into the next general election, I'll go first, is about 85 to 90.
Oh, okay. I was going to say 80. There you go. Yeah, and that felt a little bit under. But yes, I think you're probably right. I think there was a moment earlier today where people were talking about leadership challenges and the potential for it. But then we heard from one of the leading rebels, Andrea Jenkins, speaking to media today, saying that she doesn't think they've got the numbers for a leadership challenge in terms of those letters of no confidence going into the Prime Minister. If she is saying that already at this point in the cycle, I think he's going to be absolutely fine come a couple of days' time, because if she can't persuade her colleagues to join her, and her and Simon Clarke are the only two Tories that have come out now to say that they think that Rishi Sunak should go, everybody else who's briefing off the record has not got the balls to come on and put their name to it. So I just don't think it's going to happen. But, we could be wrong. Things could unravel over the next few days.
Gravitate around, just out of interest. I mean, who would... I can't believe I'm saying these words. This is one of the dreadful things about modern politics, is you have to behave as if some people like Andrea Jenkins are serious contributors to political discourse. But imagine that she is. Who would they gravitate around? Who would be a candidate? Who would be the king across the water in these cases?
So they're going to want, I think, to read that someone from the right of the Tory party, because they believe that
they're not right-wing enough.
They're not right-wing enough.
Yeah, well done.
And you heard that today from Kwasi Kwarteng when he was speaking earlier.
Oh, because he's really earned the right to be taken very seriously.
He has indeed, I'm sure.
We love him.
But look, that's he shares a lot of views. Other people in the Conservative Party do share that view. Parliamentary Conservative Party that they need to address the threat from the reform, because they are taking 11, 12, 13% of the vote, and they believe they should be taking that. So you heard from Kwasi Kwarteng earlier, he thinks the Conservatives need to be more conservative, set out what they mean. And there are many people on the right of the Conservative Party that I'm sure will be willing to stand ready for election. You saw from Suella Braverman overnight, she was at the Fareham Count, and LBC was speaking to her, and look, she did quite well. They did quite well in her ward. She is one of the people that we think will cling on to her seat, because she's got a healthy Tory majority. And it really does depend what the scale of defeat looks like for the Conservatives, and when we're thinking about what happens next, if Rishi Sunak loses that election and they have to go then into a new Tory leadership election about which way the party might go. I'm sure there's some people on the left and the centre of the Conservative Party that will stand too, but they will, inevitably have their soul-searching moment where they've got to go through some iterations. We had it after 1997, and we're going to have it again now.
You've answered a couple of the other questions I was going to ask, because you're so good at this. The significance of the reform vote and what the results mean for the general election. So, in a word, do you think that that Nigel Farage might come back into politics?
I think he's obviously thinking very long and hard about it.
That's at least 12 words.
But, one word, sorry. Okay, no.
Okay. Thank you, Natasha Clarke. Many thanks. Are you going to have a rest now, or are you carrying on through?
No, I'm powering through now.
This is the spirit.
What are you fueled by? We've got more results.
What are you fueled by?
I've just had a coffee and an orange juice.
Perfect.
Lots of sugar.
Great stuff. It's coming up to 12:56. LBC's political editor, Natasha Clarke, keeping you company throughout the rest of the afternoon. As she quite rightly reminds us, more results come in. Full disclosure, this week was a particular pleasure with a massive LBC fan. You never know for sure when you have a guest booked. A, whether they'll have the first idea who the interviewer is, and B, whether or not they have any idea what it is, even if they've heard of us, but that we actually do. But Angela and her mum actually are massive LBC listeners, and Angela, of course, is one of the best chefs in the country and a pioneer when it comes to female chefs in traditionally very male-dominated kitchens. And I can tell you that if you enjoy the hour I spent with her half as much as I did, then you're in for a massive treat when you download this week's episode of Full Disclosure.
We were working at 7 a.m. We were finishing around midnight.
Non-stop. I mean, you'd have a little lull between service. You'd have a little break
in the morning.
Right.
And then you'd have about an hour or so in the afternoon, and that was it. And then you'd carry on.
It flies a coach and horses through every law, doesn't it? Every employment law exemptions.
And then and we did that 5 days a week, and then on a Saturday we'd come in at 12. That was not lying. And then we had Sunday off, and we weren't, listen, other kitchens were doing exactly the same hours. It was the madness of it all, and France was doing the same, and everyone, until the laws all changed. But you sort of were on that adrenaline ride, I suppose. You like doing it, you love doing it, and I managed those hours for about a year, and then after a year I said, Gordon, I love you, I just can't do it another year, it's killing me. And then went off to work went to Italy. I went off to work with Giorgio in Italy, and then came back and worked for Gordon and the company. But I did love working for him. I've no regrets ever working for Gordon.
Is that a natural career path, that you do a fixed amount of the mad hours?
Yeah.
And then if you're good, you'll take a slightly more supervisory position.
Yeah, I think a lot of other people stayed there longer with Gordon. Gordon.
Right.
I obviously stayed with him longer on a long term.
Total, yes, sure.
But for that immediate, that was enough for me. And also, I knew what I always. Gordon is still the same these days. He looks after people, and I saw that he would look after people who did their time for him, and that's what I wanted to do. I want to get to a stage where he cared for me enough to go, right, your career is now in my hands, and that's what he did. And and I suppose it was a bit of, I've proved myself. I've done my year. If I need to do another 6 months, I'll do it. But
right.
if I've done enough, and you're going to look after me, and that's sort of like how it worked, really.
Where's the satisfaction at this point, Angela? Where's the because it sounds absolutely torturous to outsiders, and and you obviously putting an amazing plate of food in somebody who's got the ability to tell you that it's an amazing plate. But what's the actual thrill? What's the actual addictive nature of the work?
Addictiveness was doing wonderful food. You loved it. You loved that, and you were. And at the time, we were in that period of that year or 18 months. We were the hottest restaurant in London, without doubt.
Yeah.
People knew it, and
so it's like playing for Real Madrid.
Exactly. I still think today, and this is where I've got the most bizarre sense of humour. But I remember one night going out to friends. And we'd gone to an opening, it was a Sunday night, and everyone said, you work at the aubergine. That's like the Vietnam of kitchens, which to me I thought was hysterical. I just thought that was... And I came in the next day and started to tell Gordon, and I could see Marcus and other people looking at me going, where is she going with... Is she want to wind him up from the start of the week on a Monday morning? And I was just in hysterics about it. I said, they call it, because to me, and that's where... What I did like is working for Gordon, because Gordon's only 2 years older than me. So it felt like... And because I had come a really weird way into his kitchen, I hadn't done my 3 years at college. I hadn't worked in any hotel kitchen, hadn't worked in any big kitchen. I came from these smaller kitchens, and I never knew the hierarchy that you wouldn't answer back. Not answer back, but you wouldn't say, well, actually, and I remember one time Gordon said, well, who's made this? And I just went, well, it was him, and of course everyone was like, what's she doing? But Gordon liked that about me, that I would be a bit mad. So we got on well, and I think and he certainly had a certain affection for me in that respect.
The Gordon there, in case you were wondering, was of course Gordon the Gopher, the famous companion in the Broom. No, it was Gordon Ramsay. And that is Angela Hartnett, who is an absolutely lovely woman, a brilliant chef, and a superb interviewee. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can also find Full Disclosure, of course, a whole archive of wonderful interviews. It's the official LBC app, where you can also pause and rewind live radio. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick. But now, and of course I don't think I'm here on Monday, so I have a glorious bank holiday weekend. But before all of that, it's Sheila Fogarty It's Sheila Fogarty. 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 It's Sheila Fogarty.